Welcome, weary soul, to the cursed lands where scarlet blooms eternal and ancient sorrows take root in poisoned earth. Tonight we descend into the depths of corruption and beauty intertwined, where forgotten gods of decay slumber beneath the world, and demigods bear the burden of endless rot. Here, in this place between sleep and waking, we shall trace the crimson threads that bind together the fate of the lands between, following pathways of pestilence that lead to understanding. Close your eyes when ready, and let the gentle whispers of renewal and ruin carry you into peaceful rest. In the beginning, long before the Golden Order cast its light across the lands between, long before the Erd Tree stretched its roots deep into the Earth's heart, there existed forces so primal and fundamental that they predated the very concept of civilization itself. Among these ancient powers, sleeping in the deepest places where light had never touched, lay the essence of decay made divine. This was not merely sickness or corruption, as mortals understand such things, but something far more profound and terrible. The god of rot, whose very existence represented the sacred cycle of death and rebirth that governs all living things. Far beneath the surface world, in caverns that had never known the warmth of sun or moon, stretched the lake of rot, a vast underground sea of crimson corruption that served as both prison and throne room for this ancient deity. The lake's waters, if they could be called waters, glowed with an inner light that was neither warm nor cold, neither welcoming nor repulsive, but simply eternal in its alien beauty. Here, in these depths where normal life could not survive, the god of rot had been sealed away by powers whose names had been forgotten by history, their deeds remembered only in the most fragmentary of legends. The cavern walls surrounding this accursed lake bore witness to eons of worship and veneration, their surfaces carved with symbols and reliefs that depicted the complex hierarchy of those who had served the sealed god in ages past. These were not crude scratchings made by primitive minds, but sophisticated works of art that revealed a civilization far more advanced than any that would follow it. The carvings showed processions of figures crowned with elaborate headdresses, their forms both humanoid and fungal, leading ceremonies that celebrated not the prevention of decay but its sacred necessity. Among the most striking of these ancient artworks were the depictions of the Mushroom Lords, beings who had achieved a form of nobility through their complete surrender to the rot's transformative power. These figures wore towering crowns made from the caps of enormous fungi, their bodies partially transformed into living gardens, where countless species of mushrooms grew in symbiotic harmony. The crowns themselves were works of organic architecture, rising from their heads in spiraling towers that seemed to reach toward the cavern ceiling like prayers made manifest in flesh and spore. These mushroom lords were not mere servants of the rot, but its living embodiments, beings who had discovered that decay was not an ending but a transition, not a curse, but a blessing that opened doorways to forms of existence that ordinary minds could never comprehend. Their transformation had been voluntary, a conscious choice to embrace the god's gift and become something greater than human, something that could serve as a bridge between the mortal world and the divine realm of endless renewal. They ruled over vast communities of worshippers who venerated rot not as a destroyer, but as the ultimate creator, the force that broke down the old to make way for the new. The holy vestments worn by these ancient devotees were themselves marvels of organic craftsmanship, garments that seemed to grow rather than being sewn or woven, made from materials that were part plant, part fungus, and part something else entirely. These ceremonial robes formed living connections between their wearers and the earth itself, sending root-like extensions deep into the ground to draw sustenance directly from the lake's corrupted waters. Those who wore such garments found themselves literally rooted to the sacred places they served, becoming living pillars that supported temples built from crystallized rot and fossilized decay. The worship practices of this ancient civilization were complex and sophisticated, involving rituals that celebrated every stage of the decay process as a sacred mystery worthy of contemplation and reverence. They understood that rot was not random destruction, but a carefully orchestrated transformation, a process guided by intelligence and purpose that mortals were only beginning to glimpse. Their ceremonies involved the controlled cultivation of specific forms of decay, the nurturing of particular types of corruption that would produce desired results in the spiritual development of their communities. What made the god of rot truly terrifying to those who would later encounter its influence was not merely its power over organic matter, but its ability to corrupt and transform beings that should have been immune to biological processes entirely. The Crystallians, those strange inorganic entities that seemed to be living gemstones animated by mysterious forces, proved as susceptible to the rot's influence as any creature of flesh and blood. This revealed the true nature of the ancient god's power. It was not merely a biological phenomenon, but something that operated on a more fundamental level of reality itself. When Crystallians were touched by the scarlet corruption, their crystal bodies began to bloom with organic growths that should have been impossible according to any known laws of nature. Flowers of living gemstones sprouted from their surfaces. Roots of crystallized flesh burrowed through their forms, and their inner light took on the characteristic crimson glow of the rot's influence. These transformed beings became living proof that the god of rot's power transcended the boundaries between organic and inorganic, between living and non-living, between possible and impossible. The ancient texts that survived from this lost age spoke of the rot not as a disease but as a divine essence, a concentrated form of the fundamental force that drives all change and transformation in the universe. They described it as the breath of creation itself, the power that allows new forms of beauty to emerge from the ruins of the old. To be touched by this essence was not to be cursed, but to be blessed with the opportunity to participate directly in the cosmic process of renewal and rebirth. Archaeological evidence suggested that the god of rot had once manifested in physical form as a great scorpion, a creature of such immense size and power that its very existence had reshaped the geography of the underground realm. The scorpion stinger, that ceremonial dagger fashioned from what remained of the god's physical form, served as both relic and reminder of the awesome presence that had once walked among its worshippers. This weapon, glistening with eternal corruption, had been crafted not as a tool of violence but as an instrument of sacred transformation, used in ceremonies designed to share the god's gift with chosen recipients. The scorpion form was particularly significant in the ancient symbolism of rot and renewal, for scorpions were creatures that embodied the perfect balance between death and life, poison and medicine, destruction and creation. Their venom could kill or heal depending on how it was used, and their ability to shed their exoskeletons represented the same kind of transformative death and rebirth that the god of rot offered to its followers. The great scorpion that had been the god's earthly form was said to have had a tail that could pierce any armor, claws that could shatter any stone, and eyes that could see the hidden connections between all things. The ceremonies conducted with the scorpion stinger were elaborate affairs that required participants to demonstrate their complete commitment to the path of transformation. The dagger would be used to make ritual cuts that allowed the rot's essence to enter the body directly, beginning a process of change that could take years or even decades to complete. Those who underwent this sacred scarification did not suffer from the rot's influence, but were elevated by it, their bodies becoming gardens where new forms of life could flourish in ways that had never been seen before. The underground realm where the god of rot held court was itself a masterpiece of organic architecture, a vast complex of chambers and passages that had grown rather than being built. The walls pulsed with their own inner rhythm, breathing like living tissue, while the floors were carpeted with moss and fungi that glowed with soft bioluminescence. Rivers of luminous corruption flowed through channels carved from living rock, carrying nutrients and information throughout the complex network of chambers that served as both city and organism. In the deepest parts of this underground paradise, where the god of rot's presence was strongest, the boundary between individual organisms began to break down entirely. Creatures that had been separate beings merged into collective entities, their consciousness expanding beyond the limitations of single minds to embrace forms of awareness that spanned entire ecosystems. These collective beings were not mindless hives, but sophisticated communities where individual identity was preserved within larger patterns of shared consciousness and mutual support. The worship of the god of rot was not a simple matter of offering prayers and sacrifices, but a complex philosophical system that sought to understand the deepest mysteries of existence itself. The ancient devotees were scientists as much as priests, studying the processes of decay and renewal with the same dedication that others might bring to astronomy or mathematics. Their discoveries about the nature of transformation and regeneration would have revolutionized any civilization that could have comprehended them. The sealed nature of the god of rot's prison had been designed not to prevent escape, but to protect the outside world from changes it was not ready to accept. The ancient powers that had created the Lake of Rot understood that the god's influence, while ultimately beneficial, was too profound and overwhelming for ordinary beings to handle safely. The sealing was thus an act of mercy rather than punishment, a way of preserving the god's essence while allowing the surface world to develop at its own pace. Yet even in its sealed state, the god of rot continued to influence the world above through subtle emanations that seeped upward through cracks in the earth and manifested in ways that most observers failed to recognize. Every flower that bloomed from decay, every forest that grew from the ruins of its predecessor, every act of renewal that emerged from apparent destruction, carried within it a trace of the ancient god's blessing. The cycle of seasons, the process of evolution, the transformation of caterpillars into butterflies, all of these reflected the fundamental principles that the god of rot embodied. The mushroom lords who had served as intermediaries between the god and its worshippers possessed knowledge that would have solved many of the problems that plagued later civilizations, but their wisdom was encoded in forms that required complete transformation to understand. They had discovered methods of preserving consciousness through physical death, techniques for regenerating lost limbs and organs, and ways of achieving forms of immortality that did not require the preservation of existing forms. Their libraries contained scrolls written in spores, books that could only be read by allowing them to grow within the reader's own body. As the eons passed and the god of rot remained sealed in its underground realm, the memory of its true nature began to fade from the surface world's consciousness. What had once been understood as a beneficial force became feared as a destructive plague. What had once been celebrated as divine transformation became dreaded as corruption and decay. The wisdom of the mushroom lords was forgotten, their techniques abandoned, their philosophy dismissed as the ravings of diseased minds. But forgetting does not unmake truth, and the god of rot's influence continued to work its subtle changes throughout the world above. In the deepest forests, where few mortals ever ventured, communities of fungi maintained the old ways, preserving the ancient knowledge in forms that could survive the passing of civilizations. In the hearts of mountains, where underground streams carried the lake's essence to distant lands, strange new species evolved in secret, developing capabilities that prepared them for the day when the seals would weaken and transformation could once again proceed without hindrance. The lake of rot itself remained a thing of terrible beauty, its crimson waters reflecting lights that came from no visible source, its depths containing wonders and horrors in equal measure. Fish that were more plant than animal swam through its corrupted currents, their scales replaced by flower petals, their gills opening like blooms to filter nourishment from the rich organic soup that surrounded them. Plants grew beneath its surface that existed nowhere else, their roots extending deep into dimensions that intersected with the physical realm in ways that challenged all conventional understanding of space and causality. And in the deepest part of the lake, where the pressure of eons had compressed the god's essence into forms so concentrated that they bordered on the crystalline, lay the heart of the ancient mystery. Here, where time moved differently, and the laws of physics bent to accommodate forces that predated their very conception, the god of rot waited in perfect patience for the day when the world above would be ready to embrace the gifts it had been preparing for so long. Its dreams shaped the cavern walls. Its breath gave life to impossible creatures, and its sleeping thoughts reached out through the earth to touch minds that were beginning to understand that decay and beauty were not opposites but partners in an eternal dance of creation. From the depths where ancient rot festered in divine patience, our tale rises to the surface world, where legends were born from necessity and heroes emerged, not from ambition, but from the desperate need to preserve what remained of the natural order. In those distant days, when the underground god's influence first began to seep upward through cracks in the earth, manifesting in ways that threatened to transform the surface world beyond recognition, there came a figure whose story would become the foundation for all future understanding of how flowing water could triumph over stagnant corruption. The blind swordsman, as he would come to be known throughout the ages, was not born to greatness, but thrust into it by circumstances that demanded impossible choices from ordinary individuals. His blindness, which might have been seen as a weakness by those who measured strength in conventional terms, became instead the source of his greatest power. Where others relied upon sight to navigate the world's complexities, he had learned to perceive the deeper currents that flowed beneath surface appearances, the hidden connections that linked all things in patterns of movement and stillness, growth and decay. In those early days of his legend, before he had earned the title that would echo through history, he was simply a wanderer who had learned to read the world through senses that others ignored or dismissed as unimportant. He could feel the flow of water through stone, sense the movement of air through underground passages, detect the subtle vibrations that spoke of life and death in all their myriad forms. His blindness had become a gift that allowed him to perceive reality as it truly was, rather than as it merely appeared to be. It was during one of his wanderings through the deep places of the world that he first encountered the being who would change not only his destiny, but the fate of all who dwelt above and below the earth's surface. The Blue Dancer, as she was known to those few who had glimpsed her ethereal form, was a creature of such sublime beauty and mysterious purpose that even the blind swordsman, who could not see her with his eyes, was overwhelmed by the radiance of her presence. She was not human, nor was she divine in the conventional sense, but something far more ancient and fundamental than either category could contain. The Blue Dancer existed in a state of perpetual motion that mirrored the flowing waters she embodied, her form shifting and changing like liquid light, her presence bringing with it the sense of infinite rivers flowing toward distant seas. She was dressed in cloth that seemed to be woven from water itself, fabric that moved with its own inner current, fabric that could never be still, never be stagnant, never succumb to the corruption that thrived in motionless places. The blue of her garments was not merely a color, but the essence of flowing water made visible, the promise of movement and renewal that could cleanse even the most polluted streams. When the blue dancer spoke to the blind swordsman, her voice carried the sound of rushing rapids, the whisper of rain on leaves, the gentle lapping of waves against distant shores. She told him of the growing danger that threatened to overwhelm the surface world, of the ancient god whose essence was beginning to seep upward from its underground prison, of the need for someone who could understand the true nature of the conflict that was about to unfold. The battle that was coming would not be won through conventional strength or traditional weapons, but through the mastery of principles that most warriors had never even considered. The blue dancer was, in truth, a spirit of the great underground rivers that flowed beneath the world's surface, those vast waterways that had carved their paths through stone and earth over countless eons, creating the networks of caves and passages that connected distant regions in ways that surface dwellers could never imagine. The Siofra and Ainsel rivers, those legendary waterways whose names were whispered in ancient songs and half-remembered prayers, were merely the most famous of the countless streams that fell under her protection and guidance. These underground rivers were not merely sources of water, but arteries through which the life force of the world itself flowed, carrying nutrients and information from the deepest places to the highest peaks, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed diverse forms of existence to flourish in their proper places. The blue dancer was both guardian and embodiment of this vast hydraulic system, a consciousness that had emerged from the marriage of water and time, of flow and wisdom, of motion and memory. The relationship between flowing water and stagnant corruption was not merely symbolic, but represented one of the fundamental laws that governed existence at its deepest levels. Where water moved freely, following its natural inclinations and obeying the pull of gravity and gradient, life flourished in all its myriad forms, each species finding its proper niche within the larger ecosystem of flowing energy. But where water became trapped, where its movement was blocked or restricted, where it was forced into unnatural stillness, the conditions were created for corruption to take root and spread its influence in ways that could ultimately threaten the entire system. The god of rot, sealed in its underground lake, represented the ultimate expression of this principle carried to its logical extreme. The crimson waters that surrounded the ancient deity were not truly waters at all, but a substance that had been transformed beyond recognition by eons of enforced stillness, becoming something that retained water's appearance while possessing properties that belonged more properly to living tissue. This pseudo-water had become a breeding ground for forms of life that could not exist in flowing streams, organisms that thrived on stagnation and fed upon the absence of motion. The blue dancer understood that the growing influence of the sealed god represented not merely a local threat, but a challenge to the fundamental principles upon which the world's health depended. If the corruption continued to spread, if the ancient deity's influence reached the great underground rivers and transformed them into extensions of its stagnant lake, the entire network of flowing water that sustained life throughout the world would be compromised. The consequences would extend far beyond the immediate area of infection, ultimately affecting every stream, every river, every ocean that depended upon the underground waterways for renewal and refreshment. It was for this reason that the blue dancer had sought out the blind swordsman, recognizing in him the unique combination of skills and sensitivities that would be necessary to face such an unprecedented challenge. His blindness allowed him to perceive the world through touch and sound and vibration, senses that were far more attuned to the flow of water than sight could ever be. His years of wandering had taught him to read the subtle signs that revealed the hidden connections between surface and depth, between what was visible and what lay concealed beneath layers of stone and earth. The weapon that the Blue Dancer bestowed upon her chosen champion was unlike any sword that had ever been forged by mortal hands or divine will. Rather than being crafted from metal and shaped through fire, it had been formed from the essence of flowing water itself, its blade taking the appearance of crystallized current, its edge sharp enough to cut through any substance that attempted to resist the natural order of movement and change. The sword's most remarkable property was not its sharpness or its strength, but its ability to remain forever in motion, even when held still in its wielder's hand. The flowing curved sword, as it came to be called, was patterned after the mathematical principles that governed the movement of rivers as they carved their paths through landscapes, following the laws of fluid dynamics that ensured the most efficient possible flow from source to destination. Its curve was not arbitrary decoration, but the physical embodiment of the optimal path that water takes when moving through any medium, the shape that minimized resistance while maximizing the sword's ability to channel and direct the forces it was designed to control. When the blind swordsman first took hold of this extraordinary weapon, he immediately felt the connection it created between his own body and the vast network of flowing water that lay beneath the Earth's surface. Through the sword, he could sense the movement of distant streams, feel the pulse of underground rivers, detect the places where water gathered, and the directions in which it sought to flow. The weapon became an extension of his already heightened senses, amplifying his natural abilities until he could perceive the water cycle in its entirety, from the smallest dewdrop to the mightiest ocean current. The training that the Blue Dancer provided was unlike any martial instruction that had ever been developed by conventional schools of swordplay. Rather than focusing on techniques for defeating human opponents or overcoming physical obstacles, the lessons centered on understanding the principles of flow and motion that governed all natural processes. The blind swordsman learned to move like water itself, to find the path of least resistance through any situation, to turn the force of his enemy's attacks back upon themselves through redirection rather than opposition. Most importantly, he learned to recognize the signs of stagnation in all its forms, to understand how corruption began with the blockage of natural flow and spread through the accumulation of forces that should have been allowed to move freely through their proper channels. This knowledge extended beyond the merely physical to encompass emotional, mental, and spiritual dimensions of existence, for the principles that governed the flow of water were the same principles that governed the flow of life energy in all its manifestations. The Blue Dancer taught him that victory over the god of rot would require more than simply defeating a powerful enemy in single combat. The sealed deity represented a fundamental distortion in the natural order, a concentration of forces that had been prevented from following their normal patterns of dispersal and renewal. Simply destroying such a concentration would only release its accumulated power in uncontrolled ways that could prove even more destructive than allowing it to remain contained. Instead, the Blue Dancer explained, the solution lay in restoration of proper flow, in finding ways to channel the god's immense power back into the patterns of circulation that would allow it to serve constructive rather than destructive purposes. This would require not the elimination of the rot, but its transformation, not the destruction of decay, but its integration into the larger cycles of death and rebirth that sustained all living systems. The goal was not to stop change, but to ensure that change followed its natural courses rather than being trapped in artificial configurations that served no constructive purpose. The battle that ensued between the blind swordsman and the god of rot was unlike any conflict that had ever been fought, for it took place on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. On the physical plane, it appeared as a confrontation between a mortal warrior and a divine entity of immense size and power. the great scorpion form of the ancient god wielding its massive claws and venomous stinger against the flowing blade that moved like liquid lightning through the poisoned air. But this visible struggle was only the surface manifestation of a deeper conflict that involved the fundamental forces that shaped the world's development. On the level of pure energy, the battle was a contest between stagnation and flow, between forces that sought to accumulate and concentrate power in single locations, and forces that sought to distribute and circulate that same power throughout the larger systems that depended upon it for their continued health. The blind swordsman's flowing sword became a conduit through which the immense energies of the underground rivers could be channeled, creating currents of force that carved new pathways through the crystallized corruption that had accumulated around the ancient deity. The sealing of the god of rot was accomplished not through the application of brute force, but through the creation of new channels that allowed the deity's accumulated power to flow back into the underground river system, where it could be diluted and dispersed according to natural principles. The great scorpion form dissolved not through destruction but through dissolution, its concentrated essence spreading throughout the vast network of waterways, where it would serve to enrich rather than corrupt the streams that carried it to distant destinations. Yet, even as the immediate threat was contained, the blind swordsman understood that the victory was temporary rather than permanent. The forces that had created the god of rot remained active in the world, and given sufficient time and the right conditions, similar concentrations of stagnant power could form again in other locations. The sealing was thus not an ending, but a beginning, the first step in what would prove to be an ongoing struggle to maintain the balance between flow and stagnation that the world's health required. The flowing sword techniques that the blind swordsman had learned from the Blue Dancer became the foundation for a new school of martial arts that would be passed down through generations of warriors who understood the deeper principles behind the movements they practiced. These techniques were not merely methods of combat, but forms of meditation in motion, ways of training both body and mind to perceive and work with the natural flows of energy that sustained all living systems. The legacy of the blind swordsman's victory would echo through the centuries, inspiring new generations of warriors to seek understanding of the connections between water and wisdom, between motion and mastery, between the ability to fight and the capacity to heal. His name became synonymous with the possibility of triumph over seemingly impossible odds, with the power of flowing water to overcome the mightiest obstacles through patience and persistence rather than force and aggression. But perhaps most importantly, his legend preserved the knowledge that would prove essential when the god of rot's influence began to manifest once again in the world above. This time, not through the breaking of ancient seals, but through the corruption of a being who should have been immune to such influences. The techniques he had developed, the principles he had mastered, the understanding he had gained of the relationship between flowing water and stagnant corruption, all of these would prove crucial when a new champion would be needed to face the scarlet plague that would one day threaten to consume the lands between in its crimson embrace. In the turning of ages, when the Golden Order had established its dominion over the lands between, and the Erd Tree stretched its golden branches toward the heavens, in eternal promise of prosperity and divine guidance, there came into the world 2 children whose birth would herald both the greatest hope and the most profound tragedy that the realm had ever known. Born of Queen Marika the Eternal, she who served as vessel for the greater will and embodiment of divine authority, these twins carried within their very essence the potential to reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. The children were born Empyrean, that rarest and most sacred of classifications reserved for those beings whose spiritual nature made them suitable vessels for the gods themselves. To be born Empyrean was to be marked by destiny from the very moment of first breath, to carry within one's soul the capacity to serve as a bridge between the mortal and divine realms, to possess the potential to ascend beyond the limitations of ordinary existence and become something that could guide the development of entire civilizations across the span of millennia. Empyrean twins were almost unheard of in the annals of divine history, for the forces that shaped such beings were so rare and powerful that they typically manifested only once in countless generations. That two such children should be born at the same time, from the same womb, sharing the same blessed and cursed heritage, suggested that the world was approaching a moment of unprecedented transformation, a turning point that would require multiple divine interventions to navigate successfully. Michela, the firstborn of the twins, emerged into the world trailing clouds of golden light, his very presence seeming to promise abundance and prosperity beyond all previous measure. From his earliest moments, it was clear that he embodied the principle of eternal growth, of expansion and development that knew no natural limits. His power was one of giving rather than taking, of creation rather than destruction, of building up rather than breaking down. Everything he touched seemed to flourish with supernatural vigor, plants growing larger and more beautiful in his presence, animals becoming healthier and stronger, even the stones themselves seeming to take on a more radiant appearance when bathed in his golden aura. Millennia, his twin sister, was born second, and from the moment of her arrival, it was apparent that she carried within herself forces that were quite different from her brother's generous abundance. Where Michela brought growth and prosperity, Millennia's presence was accompanied by subtle signs of decline and transformation, not in any malevolent sense, but as the natural counterbalance to her brother's expansive energy. She embodied the principle of necessary endings, the understanding that all things must eventually surrender their current forms to make way for new configurations of matter and energy. In the cosmic design that governed the birth of Empyrean beings, the twins were meant to work together as complementary aspects of the same fundamental truth, that existence required both creation and dissolution, both building up and breaking down, both the accumulation of forms and their eventual release back into the primordial energies from which they had emerged. They were intended to serve as living symbols of the great cycles that sustained all life, each one incomplete without the other, both necessary for the maintenance of the delicate balance upon which the world's continued health depended. But even as the twins drew their first breath, forces were stirring in the deep places of the world that would transform their intended destiny into something far more complex and tragic than anyone could have anticipated. The god of rot, that ancient entity which the blind swordsman had sealed in its underground prison eons ago, had not remained dormant during its long confinement, but had instead spent the centuries studying the patterns of energy that flowed through the world above, learning to recognize the moments when those patterns might be vulnerable to influence from below. The birth of an Empyrean represented one of the most significant disruptions in the normal flow of divine energy that could occur within the established order of existence. At the moment when such a being first drew breath, the barriers between different levels of reality became temporarily permeable, creating opportunities for forces that were normally kept separate to intermingle in ways that could have profound and lasting consequences. The god of rot, with its eons of patient observation and accumulated understanding, had learned to recognize these moments and to extend its influence through the cracks that opened in the cosmic structure. Millennia's birth, with its association with the principles of decline and transformation, created exactly the kind of opening that the sealed god had been waiting for. At the precise instant when she first opened her eyes upon the world, tendrils of scarlet corruption reached up from the depths where the ancient deity slumbered, threading their way through dimensions of space and time that existed parallel to the physical realm, seeking the newborn consciousness that resonated so perfectly with their own fundamental nature. The corruption that touched Millennia at the moment of her birth was not a crude infection or simple disease, but something far more sophisticated and insidious. It was the god of Rot's own essence, refined and concentrated through eons of divine contemplation, shaped into a form that could merge seamlessly with the infant's developing spiritual nature without destroying the qualities that made her suitable as a vessel for divine power. The corruption became part of her very identity, woven so deeply into the fabric of her being that separating it from her essential self would have been like trying to remove the color from light or the wetness from water. This divine corruption manifested not as obvious sickness or visible deformity, but as a subtle alteration in the way that Millennia's Empyrean nature expressed itself in the world. Where other beings blessed with such spiritual gifts might have radiated pure light or healing energy, Millennia's presence carried with it the complex beauty of things in transition, the haunting loveliness of forms caught in the process of surrendering their current configurations to embrace new and unknown possibilities. Her great rune, that fragment of divine power that served as both birthright and burden for all who carried Empyrean blood, bore the unmistakable marks of the corruption that had touched her at the moment of her creation. Under normal circumstances, her rune should have been the most sacred of all such artifacts, a perfect crystallization of the divine principles that governed growth and abundance, and the generous sharing of prosperity among all who dwelt beneath the Erd tree's protective canopy. Instead, the rune that formed within Millennia's spiritual essence was something far more complex and ambiguous, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. It pulsed with energies that promised both healing and harm, growth and decay, life and death, intermingled in patterns that defied easy categorization. Those who looked upon it with eyes capable of perceiving divine emanations spoke of its beauty in hushed, almost frightened tones, for it possessed a kind of perfection that was both compelling and deeply disturbing. The duality that emerged from the twins' combined nature was more profound than anyone had initially realized. In the original design for their existence, Michaela and Millennia were meant to embody complementary aspects of the same cosmic principle, two facets of a single divine truth that required both perspectives to be properly understood. But the god of Rot's interference had introduced a third element into this carefully balanced equation, creating not a simple duality, but a complex tension between three different approaches to the fundamental questions of existence. Miquela continued to represent the principle of boundless growth and generous abundance, his nature unmarked by the corruption that had touched his sister at the moment of their shared birth. His power remained focused on building up, on creating new forms of beauty and prosperity, on finding ways to enhance and expand the positive aspects of whatever he encountered. He was the embodiment of optimism made divine, the promise that all problems could be solved through sufficient application of creativity and care. Millennia, however, now carried within herself both the original principle of necessary transformation and the god of Rot's more radical vision of renewal through complete dissolution. Her nature had become a battleground where two different philosophies of change struggled for dominance, sometimes working together toward common goals, and sometimes pulling her in opposite directions as their fundamental incompatibilities became apparent. The corruption that flowed through her veins was not content to remain a passive passenger in her developing consciousness, but actively shaped her understanding of the world and her place within it. It whispered to her of the beauty that lay hidden within decay, of the new forms of life that could emerge from the ruins of the old, of the liberation that came from surrendering attachment to temporary configurations of matter and energy. These whispers were not malicious lies, but genuine insights into aspects of reality that most beings preferred to ignore or deny. As Melania grew from infant to child to young woman, the physical manifestations of her inner corruption began to make themselves apparent in ways that could no longer be concealed from those around her. The process was gradual and initially subtle, beginning with small changes that might have been attributed to ordinary childhood ailments or minor accidents. A fingertip that seemed slightly discolored after a minor injury, a patch of skin that felt different to the touch, a lock of hair that had taken on an unusual reddish tint. But these small changes were merely the visible symptoms of a far more profound transformation that was taking place within the deeper structures of her physical and spiritual being. The god of Rot's essence was slowly rewriting the fundamental patterns that governed how her body related to the world around it, teaching her cells and organs to embrace forms of existence that transcended the normal boundaries between self and environment, between individual identity and collective consciousness. The statues that were carved during Melania's youth, created by artists who sought to capture her beauty and grace for posterity, serve as poignant reminders of what was lost as the corruption progressed through her developing form. In these early representations, she appears as a figure of almost heartbreaking perfection, possessed of the kind of beauty that seemed to promise that all the world's sorrows could be healed through the simple act of beholding her radiant presence. Her limbs in these early depictions are whole and strong, her skin unmarked by any sign of the internal struggle that was already beginning to reshape her essential nature. The sculptors who created these works captured not only her physical perfection, but something of the spiritual luminosity that marked her as one of the blessed, the sense that she carried within herself the potential to transform the world through the sheer force of her divine heritage. But even in these idealized representations, careful observers might have detected subtle signs of the transformation that was already underway. A certain melancholy in her expression that spoke of knowledge gained too early, a quality of fragile impermanence that suggested awareness of her own mortality despite her Empyrean nature, a beauty that was somehow made more poignant by the unspoken understanding that it would not last forever in its current form. As the months and years passed, the physical manifestations of Melania's corruption began to accelerate, moving beyond the realm of subtle changes that could be dismissed as normal variations in growth and development. The scarlet rot that flowed through her essence began to assert itself more aggressively, claiming territory within her body according to its own mysterious logic and purpose. The loss of her limbs, which would eventually become one of the most distinctive aspects of her appearance, was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual process that unfolded over years of increasing difficulty and pain. First came a numbness in her extremities, a loss of sensation that made fine motor control increasingly difficult. Then followed a weakening of muscular strength, a gradual inability to perform tasks that had once been effortless. Finally came the actual dissolution of the affected tissues, a process that was neither purely decay nor purely transformation, but something that partook of both categories while belonging fully to neither. Each limb that was lost to the corruption's advance was not simply destroyed, but translated into a different form of existence, its substance and energy returning to the cosmic cycles from which it had originally emerged. The process was painful not because it was inherently destructive, but because it forced Melania to confront the impermanence of all physical forms, including her own, in ways that most beings never had to experience directly. The progression of the scarlet rot through her body followed patterns that seemed to have their own internal logic. advancing according to principles that bore little resemblance to ordinary disease processes. Sometimes the corruption would remain dormant for months at a time, allowing her to experience periods of relative stability and normalcy. At other times, it would flare into sudden activity, claiming new territory within her flesh with an urgency that suggested response to external triggers or internal developments that remained mysterious, even to those who studied her condition most closely. Throughout these years of gradual transformation, Malenia maintained not only her sanity, but her essential nobility of spirit, refusing to allow the physical changes she was experiencing to diminish her sense of purpose or her commitment to using whatever power remained to her in service of the greater good. She understood, with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her chronological age, that the corruption she carried was not merely a personal burden, but a window into aspects of existence that most beings would never have the opportunity to explore. The inevitability of her condition's progression created in Malenia a kind of fearless acceptance that was both admirable and heartbreaking to witness. She faced each new loss, each fresh manifestation of the corruption's advance, with a courage that transformed what might have been merely tragic into something approaching the sublime. Her response to her affliction became itself a form of art, a demonstration of how consciousness could maintain its essential dignity, even when the physical vessel that housed it was undergoing radical transformation. This acceptance was not passive resignation, but active engagement with forces that most beings would have fled from in terror. Malenia chose to study her own condition, to learn from the changes she was experiencing, to find ways of working with the corruption rather than simply being victimized by it. In doing so, she began to discover that the scarlet rot, for all its apparent destructiveness, carried within it possibilities for forms of existence that transcended the normal limitations of individual identity and physical embodiment. In the halls of divine power, where the Empyrean twins grew from children into beings of immense potential and terrible burden, no sight was more heartbreaking than that of Michaela, watching his sister's gradual transformation with eyes that held both infinite love and infinite helplessness. The bond between the twins transcended ordinary sibling affection, for they had been born as complementary aspects of the same cosmic principle, two halves of a divine whole that was meant to work together in perfect harmony to guide the world toward unprecedented prosperity and wisdom. Michaela's nature was fundamentally one of giving, of nurturing, of finding solutions to problems that others might consider insoluble through the application of boundless creativity and compassion. His power manifested as an almost compulsive need to heal what was broken, to restore what was damaged, to bring growth and abundance to places where they had been absent. Every cell in his body, every particle of his divine essence, was oriented toward the preservation and enhancement of life in all its myriad forms. To witness his beloved sister's slow dissolution, to see her perfect form gradually claimed by forces that seemed to mock everything he stood for, was a torment that went beyond physical pain into realms of spiritual anguish that few beings could comprehend, much less endure. Each day brought fresh evidence of the scarlet rot's advance, new manifestations of the corruption that was slowly but inexorably transforming Malenia from the radiant goddess she had been born, to become into something that seemed to embody the very antithesis of everything divine and beautiful. Yet Michaela's response to his sister's condition was not despair but determination, not acceptance of the inevitable but fierce rejection of any reality that would demand such sacrifice from one he loved beyond measure. If the existing order of the world could not provide a cure for Malenia's affliction, then he would create a new order, one that operated according to principles that made healing possible, where healing had previously been deemed impossible. This decision marked the beginning of Michaela's transformation from a dutiful supporter of the Golden Order into something far more complex and ultimately more dangerous to the established hierarchy of divine power. For countless ages, the Golden Order had represented the ultimate expression of cosmic law, the perfect system through which the greater will expressed its intentions for the development and governance of all existence. To question the Golden Order was to question the fundamental assumptions upon which reality itself was constructed. Michela's early years had been spent in devoted study of the Golden Order's principles and practices, mastering the fundamentalist magics that drew their power from unquestioning faith in the absolute rightness of the established cosmic hierarchy. He had been, by all accounts, a model student and practitioner, someone whose natural gifts were perfectly suited to working within the existing system rather than challenging or attempting to modify it. His incantations during this period were marvels of orthodox fundamentalism, spells that channeled the Golden Order's power with such purity and precision that they seemed to glow with inner light. The golden rings that appeared when he cast these magics were perfect circles, geometrically flawless expressions of the mathematical harmony that supposedly governed all divine intervention in the mortal realm. His fellow students and teachers regarded him as the ideal example of what an Empyrean should aspire to become: powerful, knowledgeable, and completely aligned with the cosmic order that had shaped their world. But as Millennia's condition worsened and the limitations of orthodox healing became increasingly apparent, Miquella began to recognize that his devotion to established doctrine was preventing him from exploring approaches that might actually prove effective where conventional methods had failed. The Golden Order's healing magics, for all their power and elegance, operated according to principles that required the preservation of existing forms rather than their fundamental transformation. The scarlet rot that afflicted his sister was not simply a disease that could be cured through the application of conventional healing energy, but a fundamental alteration in the nature of her being that would require equally fundamental changes in the principles through which healing itself was understood and practiced. To help Millennia, Miquella would need to venture beyond the safe boundaries of orthodox magic into territories that the Golden Order had declared forbidden or impossible. The abandonment of his fundamentalist training was not a sudden dramatic gesture, but a gradual process of disillusionment that unfolded over months and years of increasingly desperate experimentation with alternative approaches to the problem of divine corruption. Each failed attempt to halt or reverse his sister's condition brought with it the painful recognition that another aspect of his carefully constructed worldview would need to be discarded in favor of approaches that might actually prove effective. The moment when Miquella first conceived the idea of unalloyed gold was one of those rare instances when theoretical understanding and emotional necessity combined to produce a flash of insight that would ultimately revolutionize not only his own magical practice, but the entire field of divine metallurgy. He realized that the corruption affecting Millennia was able to progress precisely because it had become so thoroughly integrated with her divine nature that conventional healing could not distinguish between what should be preserved and what should be eliminated. What was needed was not more powerful healing magic, but a fundamentally different approach to the relationship between divine essence and physical manifestation. One that could create barriers between different types of spiritual energy without preventing the natural flow of life force that sustained all healthy existence. This would require materials that had never existed before, substances that could interact with divine power without being corrupted or transformed by that interaction. Unalloyed gold represented Miquella's attempt to create such a material, a form of metal that would remain absolutely pure regardless of what forces it encountered, immune to corruption, not through resistance, but through a fundamental incompatibility with the very concept of impurity. This was not merely a matter of refining existing gold to higher levels of purity, but of creating an entirely new substance that operated according to principles that had never before been explored. The theoretical foundation for unalloyed gold drew upon Michela's deep understanding of the mathematical relationships that govern divine power, combined with insights gained from his study of the scarlet rot's behavior and effects. He realized that corruption spread not through random infection but through systematic exploitation of weaknesses in the target's spiritual structure, finding points where different types of energy interfaced imperfectly, and using those imperfections as entry points for transformative influence. Unalloyed gold was designed to eliminate such entry points entirely, creating a material that was so perfectly unified in its essential nature that no external force could find purchase within its structure. Every atom of the substance would be identical to every other atom, not merely in terms of chemical composition, but in terms of spiritual resonance and divine alignment. The result would be a metal that could serve as an absolute barrier against corruption, while remaining perfectly transparent to the flow of beneficial divine energy. The process of creating unalloyed gold required Michela to master techniques that had never been attempted by any previous practitioner of divine metallurgy, methods that combined traditional alchemical procedures with innovations that drew upon his unique understanding of Empyrean power and cosmic law. The work required not only intellectual understanding, but emotional commitment of such intensity that it began to reshape his fundamental nature as a divine being. Each batch of unalloyed gold that Michela produced carried within its crystalline structure a portion of his own essence, his love for his sister, transformed into a physical substance that could provide protection where conventional barriers had proven inadequate. The metal gleamed with a light that was subtly different from ordinary gold, possessing a purity that seemed to repel not only corruption, but any form of imperfection or compromise. The needles that Michela crafted from this miraculous substance represented the culmination of years of theoretical research and practical experimentation, devices that could be inserted directly into Millennia's flesh to create localized zones of absolute purity that the scarlet rot could not penetrate or influence. The needles were not merely physical objects, but focal points for divine intervention, channels through which Michela's healing power could reach the deepest levels of his sister's corrupted essence. When the first needle was inserted into Millennia's body, the effect was immediately apparent to anyone with the sensitivity to perceive divine emanations. The scarlet rot's advance halted abruptly in the vicinity of the golden device, its corrosive influence neutralized by the needle's perfect immunity to corruption. For the first time since her birth, Millennia experienced the sensation of having a part of her body that was completely free from the whispers and urgings of the ancient god whose essence flowed through her veins. The relief that the needle provided was not merely physical, but psychological and spiritual as well, for it gave Millennia back a measure of control over her own existence that the progression of the rot had gradually stolen from her. She could once again move the affected limb with something approaching normal dexterity, could feel sensations that had been muted or distorted by the corruption's influence, could experience her own body as something that belonged to her, rather than to the forces that sought to transform it according to their own mysterious purposes. But even as the needle provided unprecedented relief from the symptoms of Millennia's condition, its limitations became apparent through extended observation and testing. The device could halt the rot's progress and provide localized protection, but it could not reverse changes that had already occurred or eliminate the corruption entirely from her system. The needle was a treatment rather than a cure, a way of managing the condition rather than eliminating it completely. Moreover, the needles that Michela was able to create during this period of his development were incomplete versions of what he understood to be theoretically possible, prototypes that incorporated only a fraction of the capabilities that unalloyed gold might eventually be made to possess. The perfect needle that existed in his imagination would be able to not only halt corruption but actively purify it, transforming the Scarlet Rot's destructive energy into a beneficial force that could enhance rather than diminish his sister's divine nature. The creation of such a perfect needle would require techniques that pushed beyond even Michela's considerable abilities, methods that would demand resources and knowledge that simply were not available within the normal flow of time and causality. The breakthrough would require access to conditions that existed only in places where the fundamental laws of reality operated according to different principles, locations where time itself could be manipulated to allow impossible forms of creation and transformation. Farum Azula, that ancient sanctuary, where time flowed in patterns that defied normal understanding, represented exactly the kind of environment where such ultimate work might be possible. In that storm-swept realm beyond the normal flow of temporal causality, where past and future existed simultaneously, and the very concept of sequential development became meaningless, even the most impossible forms of divine craftsmanship might prove achievable. The perfect needle that could theoretically be created in such a place would not merely treat the symptoms of divine corruption, but address its fundamental causes, reaching backward through time to prevent the moment of infection from ever occurring. Such a device would essentially allow its wielder to cheat fate itself, to undo choices and events that had already been woven into the fabric of reality's development. But the creation of such an ultimate needle would require Michela to venture far beyond the safe boundaries of established divine practice into territories that were not only forbidden but potentially catastrophic to explore. The manipulation of time and causality on such a scale could have consequences that extended far beyond the healing of a single individual, effects that might reshape the fundamental nature of existence in ways that no one could predict or control. The prosthetic limbs that Michela crafted for his sister represented a different approach to the problem of her condition, one that focused on restoration rather than prevention, on replacing what had been lost rather than protecting what remained. These artificial limbs were marvels of divine engineering, devices that combined the purity of unalloyed gold with mechanical principles that allowed them to respond to their wearer's thoughts and intentions as naturally as organic limbs had once done. Each prosthetic was individually designed to match not only the physical requirements of its intended function, but the spiritual needs of the person who would wear it, creating devices that were not merely tools but extensions of the user's divine essence. The artificial arm that replaced Millennia's lost limb carried within its golden structure patterns that resonated with her particular spiritual signature, allowing it to channel her power and respond to her will as if it had grown from her own flesh and bone. The helmet and armor that Michela created to protect his sister from further corruption represented the ultimate expression of his defensive approach to her condition, garments that surrounded her with zones of absolute purity that the Scarlet Rot could not penetrate or influence. These items were not merely protective equipment but wearable sanctuaries, mobile temples that carried the inviolate peace of sacred spaces wherever their wearer might travel. The craftsmanship required to create such items pushed Michela's abilities to their absolute limits, demanding not only technical mastery, but emotional investment of such intensity that the act of creation became itself a form of worship. Each piece of armor carried within its structure a portion of his love for his sister, his desperate hope for her healing, transformed into a physical substance that could provide protection where his presence alone could not reach. Yet even as these magnificent creations provided Millennia with unprecedented protection and functionality, Their very necessity served as constant reminders of what had been lost, of the perfect form she might have possessed, if not for the corruption that had claimed so much of her original beauty. The prosthetics were simultaneously expressions of hope and monuments to tragedy, testaments to both the power of love and the limitations that even divine devotion could not transcend. The incomplete nature of all Miquella's creations during this period reflected not any failure of skill or understanding on his part, but the fundamental constraints under which he was forced to work. The perfect healing that his sister deserved would require not just superior craftsmanship, but access to forms of power and knowledge that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. Until such access could be achieved, even his most successful efforts would remain partial solutions to a problem that demanded complete transformation of the conditions under which divine healing operated. The tragedy of Miquella's devotion lay not in its ultimate failure, but in its partial success, in the way that his innovations provided just enough relief to make the remaining suffering more poignant, just enough hope to make the continuing deterioration more heartbreaking. His needles could halt the rot's advance but not reverse its effects. His prosthetics could replace lost function, but not restore lost beauty. His armor could provide protection, but not eliminate the need for such protection in the first place. This pattern of partial success would define Miquella's relationship with his sister's condition throughout the years that followed, as each new breakthrough brought with it fresh awareness of how much more remained to be accomplished. The scarlet rot that flowed through Millennia's veins was not merely a medical condition to be treated, but a fundamental aspect of her nature that would require nothing less than the complete reconstruction of divine law to address successfully. And such reconstruction would demand sacrifices that even Miquella's boundless love might not be sufficient to sustain. In the shadowed years that followed Miquella's tireless efforts to ease his sister's suffering, when the unalloyed gold prosthetics had restored a measure of function to Millennia's transformed form, but could not touch the deeper corruption that continued to flow through her essence like liquid fire, there came a moment of providence that would change not only her understanding of her condition, but her entire approach to existing within a body that served as both temple and battleground for forces beyond mortal comprehension. The meeting between Millennia and the figure who would become her most influential mentor was not a chance encounter, but the culmination of events that had been set in motion long before either of them had been born. Threads of destiny that stretched back through the centuries to the ancient sealing of the god of rot, and forward toward conflicts that would reshape the very foundations of the world. The blind swordsman, that legendary warrior whose victory over the scarlet corruption had become the stuff of myth and half-remembered songs, had been watching the progression of Millennia's condition with the patient attention of one who understood better than anyone else what forces were stirring in the depths of her transformed flesh. The prosthesis wearer heirloom, that precious artifact which depicted their first meeting in lines of silver and gold, worked into patterns that seemed to capture not merely the appearance of that momentous encounter, but something of its spiritual significance as, well, showed Millennia in her state of partial restoration, her unalloyed gold limbs gleaming with the pure light that her brother's love had woven into their very substance. The scene portrayed was one of recognition rather than introduction, as if both figures had been expecting this moment and understood its importance even before the first words were exchanged between them. The blind swordsman approached Millennia not as a stranger seeking to offer unsolicited advice, but as someone who carried within his own body and mind the accumulated wisdom of direct experience with the forces that now shaped her existence. His blindness, which had once seemed like a limitation to be overcome, had become over the centuries the source of his greatest insight, allowing him to perceive the world through senses that were not deceived by surface appearances or distracted by the immediate drama of visible events. When he looked upon Millennia with those unseeing eyes that had learned to read the deeper currents of reality, he saw not a victim of corruption or a tragic figure deserving of pity, but a being who had been granted an opportunity that few would ever encounter. The chance to understand the nature of transformation from the inside, to experience the process of fundamental change, not as an observer, but as an active participant in forces that most beings could only contemplate from a safe distance. The recognition that passed between them in that first meeting was the acknowledgement of a shared understanding that transcended the normal categories of teacher and student, mentor and protege, helper and helped. The blind swordsman had spent eons studying the principles of flowing water and their application to the combat against stagnation and corruption. But his knowledge had remained largely theoretical, based on observation and deduction, rather than direct experience of the forces he had learned to oppose. Millennia, on the other hand, carried within her own body a living laboratory where the principles of rot and renewal played out their eternal drama on a scale intimate enough to be studied in detail, yet profound enough to reveal the cosmic laws that govern such processes throughout the universe. Her condition was not merely a personal affliction, but a window into the fundamental mechanisms through which change and transformation operated at the deepest levels of existence. The wisdom that the blind swordsman brought to their relationship was not the conventional wisdom of established martial traditions or the accumulated knowledge of formal schools of swordplay, but something far more rare and valuable: the understanding of how to work with forces rather than against them, how to find strength in apparent weakness, how to transform the very obstacles that seemed most insurmountable into sources of unprecedented power and capability. His recognition of the ancient enemy that dwelt within Millennia's essence was immediate and complete, for he had spent centuries studying the scarlet corruption in all its manifestations, and understood its nature better than perhaps any other living being. He could perceive the way the god of rot's influence shaped her thoughts and emotions, could sense the constant struggle between her essential self and the alien consciousness that sought to guide her development according to its own mysterious purposes. Yet his response to this recognition was not fear or revulsion, not an attempt to destroy or exorcise the corruption that inhabited her, but something far more sophisticated and ultimately more effective: the decision to teach her how to establish a productive relationship with the forces that had become part of her fundamental nature. He understood that the scarlet rot could not be eliminated from her system without destroying her entirely, but it could be channeled, directed, transformed from a source of random destruction into a tool of focused creation. The approach that the blind swordsman brought to Millennia's training represented a complete departure from conventional methods of dealing with divine corruption, which typically involved either attempts at purification through external intervention or acceptance of inevitable defeat as the corruption consumed its host completely. Instead, he proposed a third path that required neither the elimination of the corrupt influence nor surrender to its dominion, but the development of techniques that could harness its power while maintaining the essential integrity of the self that wielded it. This philosophy of constructive coexistence rather than destructive opposition drew upon the deepest insights that the blind swordsman had gained during his legendary battle with the god of rot centuries earlier. His victory had not been achieved through the application of superior force or the deployment of more powerful weapons, but through his understanding of how flowing water could work with existing currents rather than fighting against them, redirecting destructive energies into constructive channels rather than attempting to halt their movement entirely. The techniques that he began to teach Melania were based on these same principles of flow and redirection, methods that treated her body not as a battlefield where opposing forces struggled for dominance, but as a river system where different types of energy could be guided into patterns of mutual cooperation rather than destructive conflict. The scarlet rot that flowed through her veins could be made to serve her purposes rather than its own, but only if she learned to understand its nature and work with its essential characteristics rather than fighting against them. The waterfowl dance, that signature technique which would eventually become Melania's most recognizable and devastating combat ability, emerged from this philosophy of harmonious coexistence between seemingly incompatible forces. The dance was not merely a sequence of sword movements or a choreographed routine of attacks and defenses, but a physical embodiment of the principles of flowing water applied to the specific challenges posed by her unique condition and capabilities. Each movement in the dance was designed to channel the scarlet rot's energy in ways that enhanced rather than undermined her natural abilities, transforming the corruption's destructive potential into constructive force that could heal her body, even as she moved through complex patterns of offense and defense. The technique required her to remain in constant motion, never allowing her energy to stagnate or accumulate in ways that might provide the corruption with opportunities to assert its own agenda over her conscious intentions. The healing that occurred during the execution of the waterfowl dance was not conventional restoration of damaged tissues or the replacement of lost substances, but something far more sophisticated and ultimately more effective: the continuous renewal of her entire system through the dynamic balance of opposing forces working together toward common goals. The scarlet rot's capacity for transformation became a tool for maintaining optimal function rather than a source of progressive deterioration. The philosophy underlying this technique extended far beyond mere combat applications to encompass an entire approach to existence that treated life itself as a dance of flowing energies that could be guided into constructive patterns. Through proper understanding and skillful application of appropriate principles, the blind swordsman taught Melania that her condition was not a curse to be endured or a weakness to be concealed, but a form of power that required specialized knowledge to unlock and direct effectively. The training that accompanied the development of these techniques was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in the history of martial instruction, for it required the student to work directly with forces that most warriors spent their entire careers learning to avoid or overcome. Melania had to learn to welcome the corruption's influence while maintaining her essential identity, to embrace transformation while preserving continuity, to accept change while directing its course according to her own conscious intentions. The process demanded not only physical conditioning and technical skill, but psychological preparation of unprecedented depth and complexity, for it required her to develop forms of self-awareness that could function effectively even when the boundaries between self and other, between individual identity and collective consciousness, became fluid and permeable. She had to learn to maintain her sense of purpose and direction, even when the scarlet rot's whispers grew strongest, even when the ancient god's alien perspective threatened to overwhelm her own understanding of what was right and necessary. The wings that Melania gained through this training were not merely decorative additions to her appearance or symbolic representations of her elevated status, but functional expressions of the new relationship she had established with the forces that flowed through her being. These wings allowed her to move through three-dimensional space with unprecedented grace and precision, to attack from angles that conventional opponents could not anticipate or defend against, to transform the battlefield itself into an extension of her own body and will. More importantly, the wings represented her successful integration of the corruption's transformative power with her own essential nature, the achievement of a synthesis that preserved what was most valuable about her original self, while incorporating new capabilities that had never existed before in the history of divine development. She had become something genuinely unprecedented, a being who embodied both the principles of the Golden Order and the alien wisdom of the ancient Rot God, without being completely defined by either influence. The strength that emerged from this integration was indeed unparalleled, not because it represented the simple accumulation of power from multiple sources, but because it demonstrated the possibility of creative synthesis between forces that had previously been considered mutually exclusive. Millennia's abilities during this period of her development suggested forms of existence that transcended the traditional boundaries between order and chaos, between preservation and transformation, between individual identity and collective consciousness. The pride that she maintained throughout her transformation was not the simple arrogance of one who had achieved victory over overwhelming odds, but the more complex satisfaction of someone who had learned to find beauty and meaning in circumstances that might have driven others to despair or madness. She had discovered that dignity could be preserved even in the midst of fundamental change, that identity could remain coherent even when its external expressions underwent radical alteration. This pride would prove to be both her greatest strength and her most significant vulnerability, for it was built upon the assumption that she could maintain control over her condition indefinitely, that the techniques she had learned and the relationship she had established with the scarlet corruption would prove stable and enduring under any circumstances she might encounter. The possibility that she might face situations where even her mastery of flowing water principles would prove insufficient had not been seriously considered during her training. The blind swordsman, for his part, understood the limitations of what he had been able to teach her, but he also recognized that she had progressed as far as anyone could be expected to go in working with forces of such fundamental alienness and power. He had given her the tools she would need to maintain her essential self in the face of almost any challenge, but he could not protect her from the kinds of extreme circumstances that might demand choices between preserving her individual identity and serving larger purposes that transcended personal concerns. The mentor-student relationship that had developed between them was built upon mutual respect and understanding that went far beyond conventional educational frameworks, for each had learned from the other in ways that transformed both their understanding of the principles they studied and their appreciation of what was possible when those principles were applied with sufficient skill and dedication. The blind swordsman had gained new insights into the practical applications of his theoretical knowledge, while Millennia had acquired not only technical skills but philosophical perspectives that would guide her actions in the trials that lay ahead. The legacy of their time together would endure long after their paths had diverged, influencing not only Millennia's approach to the challenges she would face, but the development of entirely new schools of thought about the relationship between corruption and consciousness, between individual identity and cosmic forces, between the preservation of traditional values and the embrace of transformative change. The techniques they had developed together would inspire future generations of warriors and scholars, though few would prove capable of applying them with the same degree of skill and understanding that their original creator had achieved. The preparation that this training provided would prove essential when Millennia eventually faced the choice that would define the rest of her existence, the decision to abandon the pride and dignity that her mentor had helped her cultivate in service of goals that seemed to demand the sacrifice of everything she had learned to value about herself. The blind swordsman had given her the foundation she would need to survive such a sacrifice and perhaps even to find a way back to herself afterward, but he could not spare her the necessity of making that choice when the moment arrived. In the southern reaches of the lands between, where the red sands of Caelid stretched toward horizons painted crimson by perpetual sunset, there grew to prominence a figure whose legend would rival even the most celebrated heroes of the Golden Order's golden age. This was Radahn, born of noble blood and destined for greatness, yet shaped by influences that would make him something unique among the demigods who claimed dominion over the fractured realm. His story was one of aspiration and achievement, of power earned through dedication and strength gained through understanding, but it was also a tale that would ultimately intersect with forces of corruption and transformation that would test the limits of even his considerable abilities. The union that produced Radahn was itself a symbol of the complex political and spiritual alliances that characterized the Age of Fire's mature period, when the Golden Order had grown secure enough in its dominance to forge partnerships with powers that had once been considered foreign or potentially threatening. Queen Rennala of Caria brought to this marriage the ancient wisdom of lunar sorcery and stellar divination, traditions that stretched back to civilizations that had flourished before the Erd Tree's roots had first touched the earth. King Consort Radagon contributed the martial strength and divine authority that came with his position as champion of the Golden Order, his red hair serving as a visible symbol of the fire that burned within him. From this union of moon and tree, of ancient wisdom and contemporary power, came children who embodied the potential for synthesis between different approaches to understanding and shaping reality. Radahn inherited aspects of both his parents' natures, but his temperament and inclinations drew him more strongly toward his father's example than his mother's traditions, perhaps because the path of the warrior seemed to offer more direct routes to the kind of glory and achievement that called to his ambitious spirit. The golden lion that adorned Radahn's armor was not merely decorative symbolism, but a conscious declaration of allegiance to the heroic ideals that Godfrey had embodied during his legendary career as the first Elden Lord. Godfrey's example represented everything that Radahn found most inspiring about the possibilities that existed within the established order: the chance to win glory through personal excellence, to achieve greatness through the application of strength and skill to worthy causes, to leave behind a legacy that would inspire future generations to reach beyond their apparent limitations. The culture of Caria, with its emphasis on subtle magic and patient observation of cosmic cycles, held less appeal for someone whose nature called him toward direct action and immediate achievement. While he certainly possessed the intellectual capacity to master the complex sorceries that were his birthright, Radahn's heart was drawn to more straightforward expressions of power, techniques that could transform intention into reality through the application of focused will, rather than elaborate theoretical frameworks. His relationship with Leonard, the horse who would become his most constant companion and trusted friend, began during his youth as a simple matter of affection between a boy and his favorite mount. The horse was indeed small and unremarkable by the standards typically applied to war steeds, lacking the size and strength that would normally be considered necessary for carrying a warrior into battle. But Leonard's limitations became irrelevant, as Radahn's own size and strength began to exceed normal human proportions, creating a situation where conventional solutions would have demanded that he abandon his cherished companion in favor of more practical alternatives. The refusal to make such an abandonment revealed something fundamental about Radahn's character, a loyalty to those he cared about that transcended purely practical considerations. Rather than accepting the necessity of parting from Leonard, he chose to seek out forms of knowledge and power that would make their continued partnership possible, demonstrating the kind of creative problem-solving that would characterize his approach to many of the challenges he would face throughout his career. The gravitational magics that Radahn learned in Celia represented a form of sorcery that was both practical and profound, techniques that manipulated one of the fundamental forces that governed the behavior of matter throughout the universe. These spells required not only intellectual understanding of complex theoretical principles, but the development of intuitive sensitivity to forces that most beings never consciously perceived, the ability to feel and work with the invisible threads that connected all massive objects in patterns of mutual influence and attraction. The town of Celia, where Radahn pursued these studies, was itself a marvel of magical learning, a community dedicated to exploring aspects of sorcery that could not be taught anywhere else in the known world. The knowledge preserved in its libraries and laboratories had been accumulated over centuries of careful observation and experimentation, representing insights into the nature of reality that few scholars had ever achieved. The decision to share this knowledge with an outsider, even one of royal blood, suggested recognition of Radahn's exceptional potential and serious commitment to magical learning. The relationship between gravitational magic and stellar observation that characterized Celia's approach to sorcery would prove to be more than academically significant in the years that followed, for the town's location and its residents' expertise made it uniquely valuable as a center for monitoring and potentially influencing the cosmic forces that shaped the world's development. The falling stars that periodically threatened to reshape the landscape through catastrophic impact were not random events but part of larger patterns that could be predicted and potentially controlled by those with sufficient knowledge and power. Radahn's growth to enormous size, which some chroniclers attributed to the influence of his great rune while others suggested more mysterious causes, transformed him from a skilled warrior into something approaching a force of nature in his own right. His increased mass and strength allowed him to wield weapons and deploy techniques that would have been impossible for beings of normal proportions, but they also created new challenges in terms of mobility and coordination that required innovative solutions. The Redmane Knights who gathered around Radahn during this period were not merely soldiers seeking service with a powerful lord, but individuals who had been inspired by his example to strive for forms of excellence that they might never have imagined achieving on their own. The culture that developed within their ranks emphasized not only martial prowess, but the kind of unwavering loyalty and mutual support that could transform a collection of individual warriors into a unified force capable of achieving objectives that would have been impossible for any of them to accomplish alone. The red-maned lion that served as their symbol represented more than heraldic decoration, embodying the fierce pride and protective instincts that characterized the ideal toward which all members of the order aspired. Like lions defending their territory and their kin, the Redmane Knights developed a reputation for courage that bordered on the legendary, a willingness to face overwhelming odds when duty or honor demanded such sacrifice. The techniques that Radahn shared with his most trusted followers, including the gravitational manipulations that he had mastered in Celia, created among the Redmane's capabilities that set them apart from conventional military forces. Warriors like Ogre, who had served longest and achieved greatest mastery of these advanced techniques, became living examples of what dedication and proper instruction could accomplish when combined with natural talent and unwavering determination. The shields and weapons that bore the Redmane insignia were crafted according to principles that reflected their users' commitment to both individual excellence and collective identity, designs that maximized functional effectiveness while serving as visible declarations of allegiance to the ideals that united the Order. The fang-shaped shields in particular embodied the aggressive defensive philosophy that characterized Radahn's approach to warfare, tools that could protect their bearers while simultaneously serving as weapons in their own right. The Alabaster Lord, who became Radan's teacher in the most advanced applications of gravitational sorcery, represented a connection to forms of knowledge that predated human civilization, wisdom that had been preserved through cataclysmic changes that had destroyed entire species and reshaped continents. These ancient beings possessed an understanding of cosmic forces that human scholars had only begun to glimpse, insights into the relationships between stellar movements and terrestrial events that could prove crucial in the conflicts that were approaching. The meteoric origins of these lords' existence gave them perspectives on the nature of destructive transformation that were uniquely relevant to the challenges that Radan would eventually face, for they had experienced firsthand what it meant to be both destroyer and destroyed, to serve as agents of catastrophic change, while simultaneously being products of such change themselves. Their teaching methods reflected this understanding, emphasizing not merely the technical mastery of gravitational techniques, but the psychological preparation necessary to wield such power responsibly. The falling stars that threatened Celia represented more than a local hazard requiring defensive measures, embodying forces of change and transformation that operated according to principles that transcended normal categories of cause and effect. These stellar interventions carried with them the potential to reshape not merely the physical landscape, but the spiritual and political relationships that governed the world's development, creating new possibilities while destroying established patterns of order and meaning. Radan's decision to defend Celia from this cosmic threat was motivated by considerations that went beyond simple gratitude for the knowledge he had received there, reflecting his understanding that the preservation of centers of learning and culture was essential to the continued health of civilization itself. The destruction of Celia would have represented not merely the loss of a single community, but the elimination of irreplaceable knowledge and capabilities that could never be fully reconstructed. The techniques that he employed to halt the star's movement required him to extend his gravitational influence across vast distances and maintain that influence indefinitely, creating a form of cosmic intervention that had never before been attempted by any being, human or divine. The success of this endeavor demonstrated not only his mastery of the relevant magical principles, but his capacity to sustain enormous expenditures of energy over extended periods without losing focus or effectiveness. Yet the very magnitude of his success created new problems that had not been anticipated in the original planning of his defensive measures. By freezing the star's movement entirely, rather than simply deflecting their trajectories away from Celia, Radan had interfered with cosmic processes that affected far more than the immediate target of his protection. The stellar movements that he had halted were part of larger patterns that governed the flow of fate and possibility throughout the world, and their interruption had consequences that extended far beyond anything he had intended to achieve. The impact on stellar divination and fate reading that resulted from Radan's intervention created difficulties for all those whose magical practices depended upon the normal patterns of celestial movement, from the Carrion scholars who studied lunar cycles to predict future events to the ordinary folk who relied upon star positions to determine the proper timing for planting and harvesting. The night sky, once a reliable source of guidance and inspiration, had become a static display that offered no new information or insight. More significantly, the freezing of stellar movement had trapped certain destinies in states of suspended animation, preventing the natural unfolding of events that should have led to important transformations and developments. Beings whose fates were tied to particular stellar configurations found themselves unable to progress toward the fulfillment of their intended purposes, creating a growing reservoir of frustrated potential that would eventually demand release through alternative channels. The relationship between Radan's actions and the Golden Order's policies regarding cosmic intervention remained ambiguous, with different observers interpreting his motivations according to their own understanding of his loyalties and commitments. Some viewed his defense of Celia as evidence of his dedication to preserving valuable resources that served the greater good, while others suspected that his intervention had been motivated by personal considerations rather than broader policy objectives. The telescope's warning about the danger of stellar influence suggested that the Golden Order's leadership was indeed concerned about the potential for cosmic forces to disrupt their carefully maintained systems of control and authority. If the falling stars carried with them the potential to reshape the world's political and spiritual landscape in ways that challenged established hierarchies, then preventing their impact could be seen as a defensive measure designed to preserve the existing order against external threats. Yet Radahn's own relationship with the Golden Order's authority was more complex than simple loyalty or rebellion, reflecting the ambiguous position of all the demigods who possessed sufficient power to act independently while remaining nominally subject to the overall framework of divine governance. His actions served the Order's interests in some respects while potentially challenging them in others, creating the kind of complicated political situation that would become increasingly common as the stability of the established system began to deteriorate. The personal motivations that drove Radahn's choices were likely as complex as the political implications of his actions, combining genuine concern for the communities and individuals he sought to protect with the warrior's natural inclination to test himself against the most challenging opponents available. The falling stars represented a form of cosmic force that few beings would have dared to confront directly, making their defeat a form of achievement that satisfied both practical needs and personal ambitions. The techniques that Radahn developed to maintain his gravitational hold over the frozen stars required constant attention and energy expenditure, creating a burden that would affect every aspect of his subsequent existence. He had essentially transformed himself into a permanent anchor point for forces that sought to resume their natural movement, a living seal that prevented cosmic processes from following their intended courses. This sacrifice of personal freedom in service of larger objectives would prove to be a recurring theme in his story. The Redmane Knights, who witnessed their lord's cosmic victory, understood that they were serving someone who had achieved a form of greatness that transcended normal categories of heroic accomplishment. But they also recognized that such achievement came with costs that ordinary warriors would never have to bear. Their loyalty to Radahn was strengthened rather than weakened by their awareness of these costs, for they understood that true leadership often required the willingness to make sacrifices that followers could not be expected to make themselves. The long-term consequences of the stellar intervention would not become fully apparent until much later, when the pressures created by frozen destinies and interrupted cosmic processes would contribute to the conflicts and catastrophes that would ultimately reshape the entire world. Radahn's success in protecting Celia had been genuine and valuable, but it had also created conditions that would eventually demand resolution through means that he had not anticipated and could not control. The static nature of the night sky that resulted from his intervention served as a constant reminder of both the power he had wielded and the responsibility he had accepted in wielding it, a visible symbol of the way that individual choices could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate objectives. Every being who looked up at the unchanging stars was witnessing the result of one demigod's decision to place local concerns above cosmic processes, a choice that embodied both the nobility and the limitations of the heroic ideal that had guided his actions. In the years that followed the shattering of the Elden Ring, when the order that had governed the lands between for countless centuries crumbled into fragments, and the demigods, who had once served as pillars of stability, became instead agents of chaos and destruction. There began a series of movements and migrations that would culminate in one of the most catastrophic confrontations in the history of the realm. The Shattering War, as it came to be known, was not merely a conflict between rival claimants to power, but a fundamental breakdown of the systems that had maintained peace and prosperity throughout the Golden Order's long dominance. Among the armies that moved across the scarred landscape during this period of upheaval, none was more feared or more pitied than the force that marched under the banner of Millennia, Blade of Miquella, for their very presence carried with it the promise of transformation that few could welcome and none could ignore. The Cleanrot Knights, who formed the core of this army, had sworn oaths that bound them not merely to military service, but to a form of existence that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death, health and sickness, individual identity and collective purpose. The southward march that would lead to the Battle of Aeonia began not with any single dramatic decision, but as the culmination of pressures and necessities that had been building for years in the halls of the Haligtree, where Miquella's great project of creating an alternative to the Golden Order had encountered obstacles that conventional solutions could not overcome. The growing instability of the world's fundamental structures, the increasing boldness of those who challenged the established hierarchies, and the apparent approach of some final crisis that would demand unprecedented responses, all combined to create conditions where action became preferable to continued waiting. The route that Millennia's army followed as it moved toward its fateful destination took it through territories that had once been peaceful and prosperous, but now bore the scars of the conflicts that had raged across them since the Elden Ring's destruction. At Stormvale Castle, where Godric had established himself as Lord after his humiliating retreat from the capital, the army's passage became the occasion for one of those encounters that reveal the true character of the participants more clearly than any amount of formal negotiation or diplomatic correspondence could have achieved. Godric's position at this time was precarious in ways that went beyond mere military vulnerability, for his claim to lordship rested upon foundations that few found convincing and fewer still respected. His flight from Lanedell in women's clothing to escape the consequences of his failed coup had become the stuff of songs and stories that were repeated wherever warriors gathered to share tales of cowardice and dishonor. His subsequent hiding within the walls of Stormvale, trembling at the thought of facing Radahn in open combat, had done nothing to restore his tarnished reputation. The insult that Godric offered to Millennia and her brother was not delivered from a position of strength, but emerged from the desperate bravado of someone who understood that his own inadequacies made him vulnerable to the contempt of those whose accomplishments highlighted his failures. The malformed twins, as he called them in his rage and fear, represented everything that he himself was not: powerful, purposeful, possessed of clear vision, and unwavering commitment to goals that transcended personal aggrandizement. The battle that followed this exchange was brief and decisive, demonstrating the vast gulf that separated genuine martial prowess from the empty posturing that characterized so much of the Shattering War's political maneuvering. Millennia's response to Godric's challenge was neither cruel nor merciful, but simply efficient. The application of exactly as much force as was necessary to resolve the situation, without unnecessary waste of time or energy. The mercy that she showed in sparing Godric's life was not motivated by compassion for his weakness or respect for his position, but by the recognition that his great rune held no value for the purposes that drove her southward march. If she had been seeking to accumulate power through the conquest of rival claimants, as so many assumed during that chaotic period, then Godric's rune would have represented a valuable prize worthy of claiming through his death. Her decision to leave him alive and humiliated rather than dead and honored suggested that her motivations were more complex than simple ambition for dominance, that her march toward Caelid was driven by considerations that had little to do with the conventional objectives that motivated most participants in the Shattering War. The theories that emerged to explain her behavior ranged from the practical to the mystical, but none achieved the certainty that would have made her actions predictable or her ultimate intentions clear. The possibility that she sought to challenge Radahn simply for the glory of testing her strength against the mightiest of the demigods appealed to those who understood war primarily as an expression of personal honor and individual excellence. Such a motivation would have been consistent with the warrior culture that both she and Radahn had inherited from their respective traditions, the idea that true greatness could only be proven through victory over opponents of equal or superior capability. Yet this interpretation failed to account for the specific timing of her march or the particular route she chose to reach her destination, factors that suggested more complex motivations than mere desire for glorious combat. The southern direction of her movement, which took her through territories that held no strategic value for someone seeking to accumulate power through conquest, implied objectives that lay beyond the conventional goals of military campaigns. The theory that she was seeking her missing brother gained credibility from the known locations of various significant sites and the patterns of movement that would make sense for someone conducting a systematic search. Mog's palace, hidden in the depths beneath the very region where her confrontation with Radahn would eventually take place, provided a logical target for someone who had reason to believe that Miquella might be held prisoner in that remote and well-defended location. The intelligence that might have guided such a search could have come from any number of sources, ranging from reports brought by scouts and spies to insights gained through the mystical techniques that were available to someone of her supernatural capabilities. The networks of information that existed during the Shattering War were complex and often unreliable, but they were extensive enough to make it plausible that news of Miquella's fate could have reached his sister despite the efforts made to conceal his location. Yet the most intriguing possibility, and the one that best explained both the urgency of her mission and the catastrophic methods she would eventually employ to achieve her objectives, was that her march was motivated by the same cosmic considerations that had driven Rani to seek Radahn's death through other means. The frozen state of the stars, which had prevented the natural unfolding of fates and destinies that depended upon celestial movement, had created problems that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of Celia. The connection between stellar movement and divine transformation was well established in the magical traditions that had shaped both Carian sorcery and the Empyrean mysteries, making it reasonable to suppose that Miquella's own development toward godhood might have been dependent upon cosmic processes that Radahn's intervention had interrupted. The amber starlight found in Miquella's hideaway suggested that his fate had indeed become entangled with stellar influences in ways that made the restoration of cosmic movement essential to his continued progress. The ritual of lunar eclipse that Miquella had apparently been studying as a means of reviving Godwyn the Golden would have required precise coordination of celestial bodies moving in their proper courses, making any interference with stellar motion a direct obstacle to the achievement of his goals. If the resurrection of their brother represented a crucial component in Miquella's larger plans for transforming the world's spiritual and political landscape, then removing the obstacle to that resurrection would have justified almost any sacrifice. The ambiguity that surrounded Millennia's true motivations was perhaps intentional, reflecting the complex political situation that existed during the Shattering War when even close allies could not afford to reveal their complete strategies to each other. The multiple explanations that could account for her behavior allowed different observers to interpret her actions according to their own assumptions and expectations, preventing anyone from gaining a clear understanding of what she actually intended to accomplish. Yet regardless of the specific goals that drove her march, the confrontation that awaited her in Caelid would prove to be unlike anything that either she or Radahn had experienced in their previous battles, for it would demand from both of them sacrifices that went beyond the normal costs of warfare into realms of transformation that neither fully understood. The forces that had shaped their respective development would finally meet in direct opposition, creating conditions where the fundamental laws that govern divine existence would be tested to their breaking points. The armies that gathered for this confrontation represented more than military forces seeking victory over their opponents, embodying different philosophies of power and approaches to the challenges that faced the post-shattering world. The Cleanrot Knights, who served Malenia, had accepted transformation as the price of loyalty, embracing forms of existence that allowed them to function effectively despite the corruption that flowed through their bodies and souls. The Redmane Knights, who stood with Radahn, had dedicated themselves to the preservation of traditional values and established patterns of honor, maintaining their commitment to codes of conduct that had been developed during more stable periods, but still provided guidance for navigating the chaos of contemporary conflicts. Their red-maned lion banner represented not merely heraldic tradition, but active commitment to the ideals of strength and protection that had justified their service. The battlefield where these forces would meet was itself significant. Located at the heart of Caelid, where the ancient magics that had once sustained the town of Celia still influenced the fundamental properties of earth and air. The gravitational anomalies that Radahn's presence created in this region had made it a place where the normal rules of physics operated differently than elsewhere, where techniques that might have been impossible under ordinary circumstances could achieve effects that transcended conventional limitations. The opening phases of the battle proceeded according to patterns that both sides had anticipated, with the Cleanrot Knights demonstrating their superior discipline and coordination, while the Redmane Knights relied upon their individual prowess and unshakable determination to maintain their positions despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The spears that found their marks in Radahn's massive form were testament to the skill and courage of warriors who were willing to press their attacks even when facing an opponent whose size alone made conventional tactics seem futile. Yet, as the battle progressed and the casualties mounted on both sides, it became apparent that neither army could achieve decisive victory through conventional means alone. The Cleanrot Knights' coordination and tactical superiority were balanced by the Redmane Knights' desperate courage and intimate familiarity with their homeland's unique terrain and conditions. The stalemate that developed forced both leaders to consider options that they had hoped to avoid, choices that would transform the nature of the conflict from a military engagement into something approaching a cosmic event. The moment when Malenia made the decision to abandon the techniques and restraints that had defined her approach to combat throughout her career marked a fundamental turning point, not merely in the battle but in her own understanding of what she was willing to sacrifice in pursuit of her objectives. The pride that her mentor had helped her cultivate, the dignity that she had maintained despite all the transformations she had undergone, the sense of individual identity that had allowed her to work with the scarlet rot without being consumed by it. All of these became acceptable casualties when weighed against the importance of achieving whatever purpose had driven her to seek this confrontation. The physical act of sacrificing her prosthetic arm to get within striking distance of Radahn was symbolic of the larger spiritual sacrifice she was making. The deliberate abandonment of the protective barriers that had allowed her to function as an individual consciousness rather than simply a vessel for the ancient god's will. The blade that she turned upon both herself and her opponent was not merely a weapon but an instrument of transformation. a tool for breaking down the boundaries that had previously contained forces too powerful for mortal beings to safely handle. The words that she whispered as she prepared to unleash the scarlet bloom were not recorded by any observer who survived to repeat them, but the nature of the transformation that followed suggested that they were less invocation than surrender, less spell than acceptance of powers that she had spent her entire life learning to control and direct. The Scarlet Aeonia that erupted from their joining was not simply an attack or even a weapon, but a manifestation of cosmic forces that operated according to principles that transcended individual will or conscious intention. The explosion of scarlet energy that marked the battle's climax was visible across vast distances, a crimson flower of destruction and transformation that announced to all who witnessed it that the world had entered a new phase of its development, one where the careful balances and restraints of the previous age would no longer hold. The very air seemed to burn with energies that rewrote the fundamental laws governing the relationship between matter and consciousness, life and death, individual identity and collective being. In the aftermath of this cataclysmic exchange, neither participant could claim victory in any conventional sense, for both had been transformed beyond their previous forms and limitations into something that partook more of elemental force than individual personality. Millennia's consciousness retreated into dormancy as her body struggled to contain and process the cosmic energies that she had unleashed, while Radan's mind fractured under the assault of corruption that his gravitational mastery could slow but not prevent. The battlefield itself became a monument to the price of such transcendent conflict, a scarred landscape where the very stones had been changed into forms that reflected the alien beauty of forces that operated beyond normal categories of creation and destruction. The first bloom of Aeonia took root in soil that had been transformed by divine essence, creating conditions where new forms of life could emerge that had never been seen before in the natural world. The recognition among the survivors that they had witnessed something unprecedented, something that marked a fundamental change in the world's spiritual ecology, was reflected in the mixture of awe and terror that characterized their responses to what they had seen. The phantom, whose words were preserved in the site's memory, spoke not with horror at the destruction, but with something approaching religious reverence for the beauty that could emerge from such complete transformation. The Clenrot knight Finlay, whose heroic journey, carrying Millennia's slumbering form back to the Haligtree, would become one of the war's most celebrated acts of loyalty and courage, understood that her burden was not merely a wounded comrade, but a being who had been fundamentally changed by her contact with forces that few mortals were equipped to comprehend or safely approach. The path back to safety led through territories where the very air carried traces of the transformation that had occurred at Aeonia, making the journey itself a form of pilgrimage through lands that had been consecrated by sacrifice and suffering. The great tree that would eventually grow from the site of the first scarlet bloom served as both memorial and promise, a living symbol of the cycle of destruction and renewal that the battle had set in motion throughout the region. Its spiral growth pattern echoed the mathematical relationships that governed the expansion of divine energy through physical space, creating a form that was both beautiful and alien, familiar and unprecedented. The broken needle that would be found buried in the battlefield's heart was more than a relic of individual tragedy, representing the moment when even the most sophisticated protections against corruption proved inadequate to contain forces that operated on cosmic rather than personal scales. The snapping of Michaela's careful craftsmanship marked not merely the failure of technological solutions, but the transition to a phase of existence where such solutions would need to be reimagined according to entirely new principles and possibilities. In the wake of the cataclysmic blooming that had marked the climax of the Battle of Aeonia, the lands of Caelid underwent a transformation so profound and terrible that those who had known the region in its former state could barely recognize the crimson wasteland that emerged from the Scarlet Fire's embrace. What had once been fertile plains and thriving communities became something alien and hostile to ordinary life. A realm where the very air carried poison and the ground itself pulsed with malevolent energy that sought to reshape all it touched according to the ancient god's vision of renewal through decay. The Scarlet Swamp that spread outward from the site of millennia's first bloom was not merely a geographical feature, but a living manifestation of the transformation principle that governed the god of Rot's approach to existence, a vast organic network that connected distant locations through underground root systems and aerial spore clouds that carried the infection far beyond its apparent boundaries. The waters that pooled in the lower elevations were not truly water, but a substance that had been fundamentally altered by divine corruption, liquid that retained the appearance and some of the properties of ordinary moisture, while possessing characteristics that belonged more properly to living tissue. The crimson coloration that dominated the transformed landscape was not simply a matter of reflected light or mineral deposits, but the visible manifestation of the scarlet rot's presence in every aspect of the environment, from the smallest insects to the mightiest trees, from the stones beneath the earth to the clouds that gathered overhead. This pervasive redness spoke of a fundamental alteration in the region's essential nature, a transformation that had reached down to the molecular level and beyond, into realms of spiritual structure that most observers lacked the sensitivity to perceive directly. The flora that emerged in this transformed environment represented forms of plant life that had never existed before in the natural world, species that combined characteristics of different kingdoms of life in ways that challenged conventional understanding of biological categories and relationships. Trees grew that were part vegetable and part animal, their bark pulsing with circulatory systems that pumped scarlet sap through networks of vessels that served functions both nutritive and nervous, while their branches moved with purposeful intelligence that suggested awareness of their surroundings and the ability to respond to changing conditions. The flowers that bloomed throughout the scarlet swamp possessed a beauty that was both compelling and deeply disturbing, their petals displaying colors and patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles or at different times of day. These blooms were not merely decorative but served as focal points for the rot's transformative energy, broadcasting spores and emanations that could affect the consciousness and physical structure of any being that approached them without proper protection or preparation. Among the most significant casualties of Caelid's transformation were the ancient dragons that had made their homes in the region since time immemorial, creatures whose immense size and supernatural resilience had made them seem immune to the kinds of threats that could affect lesser beings. The fact that even these legendary creatures had been forced to flee before the advance of scarlet corruption spoke to the unprecedented nature of the forces that Malenia's sacrifice had unleashed upon the world. The dragon's retreat to the plateau that would become known as Dragon Barrow was not a simple strategic withdrawal, but a desperate flight from conditions that threatened their very existence. Despite their status as some of the most powerful beings in the known world, the establishment of this refuge required the displaced dragons to fundamentally alter their traditional territorial patterns and social relationships, creating new forms of cooperation and mutual defense that had not been necessary during the more stable periods that had preceded the Scarlet Catastrophe. Yet even this organized retreat could not save all of the region's draconic inhabitants from the corruption that spread with relentless persistence through every corner of their former domain. Exyx, one of the mightiest of their number, succumbed to the scarlet rot despite his best efforts to resist its influence, his transformation serving as a grim reminder that size and strength offered no absolute protection against forces that operated according to principles that transcended physical power. The fate of Grail, The ancient mother of dragons, whose immense form had dominated the landscape for centuries beyond counting, represented perhaps the most tragic single consequence of the Scarlet Bloom's expansion through Caelid. This venerable creature, whose wisdom and power had made her a stabilizing influence throughout countless generations of dragons, found herself overwhelmed by corruption that her age and accumulated spiritual weight could not deflect or overcome. The sight of Grail surrounded by her children, all of them struggling against the same inexorable decline that was claiming their matriarch, created one of the most poignant tableaux in the entire transformed landscape. The younger dragons' desperate attempts to protect and comfort their dying mother spoke to bonds of family and community that transcended species boundaries, demonstrating that even in a realm where corruption reigned supreme, love and loyalty could still find expression in acts of devotion and sacrifice. The practical consequences of losing such a concentration of draconic power extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of individual deaths, for these creatures had served important functions in maintaining the region's spiritual and ecological balance. Their presence had helped to regulate various supernatural forces that now ran wild without proper oversight, contributing to the chaotic conditions that made Caelid increasingly hostile to normal forms of life. The Redmane Knights who remained in their transformed homeland faced challenges that went far beyond the conventional difficulties of military occupation or territorial defense, for they were forced to wage continuous war against enemies that could not be defeated through traditional martial techniques. The scarlet rot that permeated their environment was not a foe that could be met in open battle or overcome through superior strategy and courage, but an omnipresent force that required constant vigilance and innovative approaches to even temporarily contain. The decision to burn away their own crests, those symbols of pride and identity that had defined their service throughout their careers, represented one of the most profound expressions of sacrifice and dedication in the annals of military history. This ritualistic destruction of their heraldic identity was not motivated by shame at their failure to protect their homeland, but by recognition that their mission had evolved beyond the conventional parameters of knightly service into something that demanded the abandonment of personal glory in favor of collective survival. The flames that they used to obliterate these symbols of their former selves served multiple purposes beyond the merely ceremonial, for fire had proven to be one of the few forces that could effectively combat the spread of scarlet corruption through organic matter. The controlled burns that they organized throughout their territory were not simply destructive acts, but carefully planned operations designed to create fire breaks and purified zones where normal life might have some chance of persisting, despite the hostile environment. The long, smouldering walls of flame that bordered Redmane territories represented engineering achievements that rivaled any of the great fortifications built during more peaceful periods, constructions that required not only technical expertise, but the kind of sustained commitment that could maintain such barriers across years and decades of constant threat. These burning ramparts served as both practical defenses against the advancing corruption and symbolic declarations that some aspects of the old order would continue to resist transformation, regardless of the cost such resistance might exact. The armorer's cookbook that preserved knowledge of fire-based techniques for combating rot represented invaluable intelligence gathered through hard-won experience in the most dangerous laboratory imaginable, insights that could prove crucial for future generations who might face similar challenges. The techniques described in these pages had been developed not through theoretical study, but through desperate experimentation under conditions where failure meant not merely academic disappointment, but corruption, madness, and death. The flame chariots that the Redmane Knights managed to commandeer and adapt for their purposes demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that became essential for survival in the transformed landscape. Improvised solutions that combined existing military technology with innovations inspired by the unique challenges posed by their environment. These mobile sources of purifying fire could be deployed rapidly to counter new outbreaks of corruption, or to support operations in areas too dangerous for conventional forces to operate effectively. The flamberge that belonged to Jeren, with its distinctive wave-like blade design that maximized the weapon's ability to channel and direct flame, became more than a personal armament to serve as a symbol of the entire defensive effort. The undulating pattern of the sword's edge reflected the way that fire itself moved through the corrupted landscape, following paths of least resistance while seeking out concentrations of organic matter that could fuel its cleansing advance. The festivals of war that Jeren organized at Redmane Castle served functions that went beyond simple military necessity, providing psychological and spiritual support for warriors who faced daily exposure to forms of horror that could break the minds of those unprepared for such challenges. These celebrations of martial valor and heroic sacrifice helped to maintain morale and unity among forces whose mission demanded them to find meaning and purpose in circumstances that seemed to offer little hope of ultimate victory. The call that went out to champions from distant lands represented recognition that the challenges facing Caelid required resources and capabilities that extended beyond what any single organization could provide, regardless of how dedicated or skillful its members might be. The promise of honorable death in service of a worthy cause appealed to warriors whose own lands had been destroyed or compromised by the various catastrophes that had befallen the post-shattering world. Meanwhile, in the areas most thoroughly transformed by the Scarlet Bloom's influence, new forms of life began to emerge that reflected the God of Rot's vision of what existence could become when freed from the constraints that had limited previous evolutionary development. The pale pests that crawled from the swamp of Aeonia were not mere insects or simple creatures, but intelligent beings whose consciousness had been shaped by direct exposure to divine essence in its most concentrated form. These creatures possessed capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of what was possible for beings of their apparent size and complexity, demonstrating forms of intelligence that allowed them to craft sophisticated tools and weapons from materials that most species could not even safely handle. Their ability to enchant their crude implements with magical properties spoke to understanding of mystical principles that rivaled the knowledge possessed by formal schools of sorcery and spellcraft. The uncanny weaponry that the pests created from their own shed carapaces and secreted substances represented a form of biotechnology that integrated the creator's living essence with the tools they crafted, producing implements that responded to their wielders' intentions in ways that purely mechanical devices could never achieve. These weapons grew stronger and more effective the longer they were used, developing characteristics and capabilities that reflected the experiences and preferences of their users. The intelligence that allowed the pests to tame and direct wild beasts spoke to forms of communication and understanding that transcended the normal barriers between different species and types of consciousness, suggesting that the Scarlet Rot's influence had created new possibilities for cooperation and coordination among diverse forms of life. The creatures they controlled were not simply dominated through superior force, but integrated into larger networks of shared purpose and collective identity. Yet despite their impressive capabilities and apparent sophistication, the pests remained fundamentally worshipful in their orientation toward the divine forces that had shaped their development, demonstrating the kind of religious devotion that characterized beings who had experienced direct contact with cosmic powers beyond their ability to fully comprehend. Their veneration of the scarlet corruption was not based on fear or compulsion, but on genuine appreciation for the gifts of transformation and enhanced awareness that it had bestowed upon them. The abandonment that characterized their relationship with Malenia reflected not any failure or inadequacy on their part, but the simple reality that she had moved beyond the immediate vicinity where her influence could provide them with direct guidance and support. Her retreat into dormancy following the Battle of Aeonia had left them without the active divine presence that had given meaning and direction to their existence, forcing them to develop their own interpretations of what their creator would have wanted them to accomplish. The title of abandoned children that was applied to these creatures carried within it both tragedy and promise, suggesting beings who had been granted extraordinary gifts, but left to discover for themselves how those gifts should be used in service of larger purposes that remained unclear. Their continued efforts to serve the goddess of rot despite her absence spoke to forms of loyalty and dedication that transcended immediate self-interest or the expectation of reward. The quotable philosophy that emerged from their collective consciousness reflected understanding of transformation and renewal that had been gained through direct experience rather than theoretical study, wisdom that could potentially prove valuable to anyone seeking to comprehend the deeper principles that governed the relationship between decay and rebirth, destruction and creation, ending and beginning. Their words carried the authority of beings who had witnessed and participated in cosmic processes that most others could only imagine or fear. The scarlet blossoms that they anticipated represented not merely biological phenomena, but spiritual events that would mark significant developments in the ongoing evolution of consciousness throughout the transformed region. These anticipated flowerings would serve as focal points for the further spread and development of the scarlet rot's influence, creating new centers of transformation that could extend the process of renewal into territories that had not yet been touched by divine corruption. The 5 sisters who emerged from this environment as examples of the scarlet blossoming principle represented the highest achievements of the god of rot's influence working through human consciousness, beings who combine the best aspects of their original nature with enhancements and capabilities that reflected the transformative potential inherent in the ancient deity's essence. Each sister embodied different approaches to the integration of corruption and consciousness, different solutions to the challenges posed by existing simultaneously in multiple states of being. The cultivation efforts directed toward these sisters by those who understood their significance reflected recognition that they represented unprecedented opportunities to study and guide the process of scarlet transformation under controlled conditions, to learn from their development insights that might prove crucial for understanding how divine corruption could be channeled toward constructive rather than merely destructive ends. Their progress toward full flowering would serve as test cases for theories about the ultimate potential of beings who had been fundamentally altered by contact with cosmic forces. The vision of scarlet Valkyries that motivated much of this cultivation work represented hopes for the emergence of beings who could serve as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms, creatures capable of understanding and interpreting the god of rot's will, while retaining sufficient connection to ordinary consciousness to communicate effectively with those who had not undergone such radical transformation. These anticipated beings would combine the power and wisdom of divine consciousness with the empathy and understanding that came from having once been fully human. The expectation that Malenia would eventually awaken from her dormancy to lead and direct these transformed beings reflected understanding of divine psychology and cosmic cycles that suggested her current absence was temporary rather than permanent, a necessary period of rest and integration following the tremendous expenditure of energy that had accompanied her first flowering at Aeonia. When she returned to active participation in the world's development, she would find waiting for her servants and allies who had been specifically prepared to assist in whatever work remained to be accomplished. In the shadow-drenched valleys that lay beyond the immediate reach of Caelid's scarlet transformation, where ancient fortresses had been built to guard against threats that their builders could never have imagined, there stood a castle whose history embodied the complex relationship between justice and vengeance, between duty and obsession, between the preservation of order and the corruption that could emerge from pursuing that order too zealously. The Shaded Castle, as it came to be known, served throughout its long existence as both sanctuary and prison, a place where the dark necessities of governance were carried out away from the sight of those who preferred to believe that peace and prosperity could be maintained without the application of violence and cruelty. The House of Murray, whose bloodline had provided castellans and executioners for generations beyond counting, represented one of those noble families whose service to the established order required them to embrace forms of duty that more fortunate lineages could afford to avoid or delegate to others. Their dual role as administrators of justice and instruments of death created within their family culture a complex understanding of the relationship between civilization and barbarism, between the maintenance of social order and the individual costs that such maintenance inevitably demanded from those who accepted responsibility for its implementation. The mask that served as the symbol of House Murray's authority was not merely ceremonial regalia, but a functional necessity that allowed its wearers to perform their duties without being consumed by the psychological burden of taking human life in service of abstract principles of justice and social stability. The carved features that adorned this mask represented not the actual appearance of any historical figure, but an idealized conception of impartial justice, a face that could look upon suffering and death without flinching, or showing mercy that might compromise the effectiveness of the deterrent effect that public execution was intended to achieve. The executioner's sword that had been wielded by generations of Murray patriarchs was crafted according to principles that emphasized efficiency and reliability rather than elegance or artistic beauty. Its broad blade designed to ensure that the final stroke would be both swift and certain, minimizing the suffering of the condemned while maximizing the impact upon those who witnessed the proceedings. The weight and balance of this weapon had been refined over centuries of use, incorporating lessons learned through the practical application of capital punishment under a wide variety of circumstances and conditions. Yet, for all its utilitarian design and grim purpose, the Murray executioner's sword possessed a kind of terrible beauty that spoke to the craftsmanship and dedication of those who had forged and maintained it throughout its long history of service. The patterns worked into its steel reflected not only aesthetic considerations but functional requirements that enhanced the blade's performance, while the precious metals and gems that adorned its hilt served both to mark its ceremonial significance and to provide the kind of perfect balance that made accurate strikes possible even under the stress and pressure of public execution. The transformation of this instrument of justice into a weapon of rebellion occurred when Elmer, the bell-bearing hunter, found himself facing the very blade that had been designed to end his life. The irony of his situation sharpening his determination to survive and escape the fate that others had decreed for him. His mastery of telekinetic techniques that allowed him to manipulate objects through the force of will alone had been developed through years of training and practice, but it reached its full potential only when applied under the extreme pressure of imminent death. The rebellion that Elmer led against his captors was not motivated by any grand political philosophy or desire to reform the systems that had condemned him, but emerged from the simple refusal of a skilled warrior to accept defeat and death when alternatives remained available to those with sufficient courage and capability to pursue them. His seizure of the executioner's sword represented not merely the acquisition of a weapon, but the symbolic appropriation of the authority that the blade represented, the transformation of an instrument of state power into a tool of personal vengeance. The overthrow of House Murray that followed was both swift and complete, demonstrating how quickly established authority could crumble. When confronted by individuals who combined sufficient skill with desperate motivation and the willingness to use extreme methods to achieve their objectives, the Castellans, who had administered the Shaded Castle's affairs for so many generations, found themselves suddenly reduced to the status of fugitives and outcasts, their traditional sources of power and authority stripped away by forces they had neither anticipated nor prepared to resist. Yet Elmer's victory proved to be as hollow as many acts of successful revenge, for the destruction of his enemies did not restore what he had lost or provide him with new purposes worthy of his formidable abilities. The castle that he had conquered became not a base for further adventures or a foundation for building new forms of authority, but a monument to the emptiness that could follow the achievement of goals that were defined primarily by opposition to existing conditions, rather than by positive visions of what might replace them. The portrait of millennia that dominated the castle's main hall served as both explanation and mystery, revealing the object of Elmer's current obsession, while raising questions about how and why he had become fixated upon a figure who had played no apparent role in his previous conflicts or concerns. The image itself was a masterpiece of artistic technique and emotional expression, capturing not merely Millennia's physical beauty, but something of the complex mixture of strength and vulnerability, nobility and tragedy that characterized her existence as both divine being and victim of forces beyond her control. The size and prominence of this portrait, which dwarfed every other decoration in the castle and commanded attention from anyone who entered the space, suggested that Elmer's interest in millennia had progressed far beyond casual admiration or intellectual curiosity into realms of devotion that bordered upon the pathological. The hours that he spent standing motionless before the image, lost in contemplation of its subject, spoke to forms of obsession that had replaced his previous goals and motivations with something far more personal and ultimately more dangerous. The phantoms that haunted the castle's corridors provided fragmentary commentary on the transformation that had overtaken both the structure and its current master, their whispered observations revealing the mixture of contempt and pity that characterized local opinion regarding the changes that had occurred since Elmer's takeover. The description of House Murray as ruined and Millennia as a severed harpy reflected the kind of crude analysis that could emerge when complex political and spiritual developments were filtered through minds unprepared to comprehend their deeper significance. Yet these ghostly voices also preserved important information about the sequence of events that had led to the castle's current condition, providing testimony that suggested Mally Murray had not been an innocent victim of Elmer's aggression but an active participant in developments that had made such aggression seem justified or even necessary. The reference to falling for the severed harpy implied that the former Castellan's devotion to millennia had created vulnerabilities that Elmer had been able to exploit in planning and executing his takeover. The survival of Mally Murray himself, reduced from lord of a great castle to a wandering exile, subsisting on whatever resources he could gather from the margins of his former domain, provided living evidence of the complete reversal of fortune that political upheavals could create even for those who had seemed most secure in their positions and privileges. His continued presence in the area, despite the obvious dangers and humiliations involved, suggested either an inability to imagine existence elsewhere or a determination to reclaim what had been taken from him. The weapon that Marley carried during his exile, the antspur rapier crafted from the chitinous remains of giant insects, reflected both his reduced circumstances and his continued commitment to the principles that had originally drawn him to worship Malenia and her scarlet corruption. This blade, with its organic origins and inherent toxicity, represented a philosophical alignment with forces of transformation and decay that conventional weapons could not embody, tools that served as extensions of their wielder's spiritual as well as physical nature. The belief system that had originally motivated Marley's devotion to Malenia was built upon foundations that went beyond simple admiration for her martial prowess or physical beauty, encompassing a complex understanding of the relationship between strength and suffering, between perfection and corruption, between the achievement of greatness and the acceptance of transformation that such achievement might require. His recognition of her as someone who had transcended normal limitations despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges she faced spoke to forms of wisdom that were rare even among those who claimed to understand the deeper mysteries of existence. The robe that Marley wore as a symbol of his dedication reflected the philosophical sophistication of his approach to worship, its description emphasizing the connection between his admiration for Malenia's achievements and his understanding of the broader principles that her example illustrated. The garment served not merely as clothing, but as a visible declaration of allegiance to ideas that challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between physical perfection and spiritual development, between individual achievement and collective responsibility. Yet the devotion that had begun as philosophical appreciation gradually transformed into something far more obsessive and potentially destructive, as evidenced by the changes that overtook the shaded castle under Marley's influence during the years before Elema's rebellion. The sinking of the castle into poisonous swamps reflected not merely environmental changes, but the physical manifestation of spiritual corruption that could result when admiration crossed the line into unhealthy fixation. The throne room filled with prosthetic limbs represented perhaps the most disturbing evidence of how far Marley's obsession had progressed, creating a grotesque shrine that combined reverence with a form of sympathetic magic that sought to achieve spiritual connection through the replication of physical conditions. These artificial limbs were not merely decorative objects, but attempts to create material links between the worshipper and the object of his devotion, tools through which he hoped to achieve forms of understanding and connection that purely mental or emotional approaches could not provide. The Valkyrie's prosthesis that served as the centerpiece of this collection represented either an authentic relic of Malenia's own transformation or a replica crafted with such skill and dedication that it could serve the same spiritual functions as an original artifact. The description of Marley's experience when embracing this device, his claim to have felt the presence of his personal goddess, spoke to forms of mystical experience that could emerge from the combination of intense devotion with physical contact with objects believed to carry divine essence. The ambiguity surrounding the prosthesis's authenticity reflected the complex relationship between material objects and spiritual significance that characterized many forms of religious devotion. The way that belief and dedication could invest ordinary items with extraordinary properties while simultaneously creating conditions where such properties might actually manifest in measurable ways. Whether the prosthesis was genuine or not, its effect upon Marley was real and profound, providing him with experiences that reinforced his commitment to the path he had chosen. The poison swamp that gradually engulfed the castle grounds served multiple functions in the development of Marley's devotion, creating both a physical barrier that protected his shrine from casual intrusion and a symbolic representation of the transformation that he sought to undergo in emulation of his goddess. The toxic waters that surrounded the structure reflected the scarlet corruption that flowed through Millennia's own body, providing her worshipper with a form of sympathetic environment that allowed him to experience, however briefly and partially, something analogous to her own condition. The Cleanrot Knights who eventually found refuge in the shaded castle represented a form of vindication for Marley's long devotion, providing him with living proof that his understanding of Millennia's significance had been correct, and that others who had served her directly could recognize the value of what he had created. Their presence transformed the castle from a site of solitary obsession into a legitimate shrine where those who had known the goddess personally could gather to preserve her memory and prepare for her eventual return. The compatibility between the castle's transformed environment and the needs of the Cleanrot Knights demonstrated that Marley's modifications to the structure and its surroundings had been guided by genuine insight into the requirements of those who had been touched by scarlet corruption. The poisonous atmosphere that would have been lethal to ordinary visitors provided these transformed warriors with conditions that were not merely tolerable but actively beneficial, allowing them to maintain their strength and purpose despite their separation from the divine presence that had originally sustained them. The supplies and resources that the castle could provide to these refugees were limited by the same factors that had led to its current condition, but they were sufficient to meet the basic needs of beings whose relationship with conventional forms of sustenance had been fundamentally altered by their exposure to divine corruption. The Cleanrot Knights required not luxury or comfort, but simply the opportunity to exist in an environment that did not actively oppose their transformed nature, conditions that the shaded castle could provide better than most locations in the post-shattering world. The community that formed around these shared needs and common devotions represented a new form of religious organization that had emerged from the intersection of individual obsession with collective purpose, creating structures of mutual support and shared understanding that could sustain both the knight's practical requirements and Mali's spiritual aspirations. The castle became not merely a shrine but a functioning monastery where different forms of devotion to the same divine figure could coexist and reinforce each other. Yet even as this community provided its members with forms of meaning and purpose that had been absent from their lives since Millennia's retreat into dormancy, it remained fundamentally incomplete without the presence of the goddess herself. The expectation that she would eventually awaken and return to active participation in the world provided hope that sustained their current activities, while also creating forms of anticipation that could prove problematic if fulfillment was delayed indefinitely, or if her return took forms that differed significantly from what her followers expected and desired. In the crimson wasteland that Khaled had become following the first blooming of Aeonia, where ordinary life struggled against the pervasive influence of divine corruption and new forms of consciousness emerged from the marriage of decay and transformation, there appeared 5 beings who represented the most perfect expressions of the Scarlet Rot's potential to create beauty from destruction, meaning from chaos, and purpose from the apparent randomness of mutation and change. These were the Scarlet Daughters, as they came to be known, each one a living embodiment of different approaches to the fundamental questions of identity and transformation that the God of Rot's influence posed to all who encountered its sublime and terrible gifts. Among these extraordinary beings, none was more remarkable or more tragic than the one who would become known as Millicent, a figure whose journey from helpless victim of corruption to active agent of her own destiny would illuminate both the possibilities and the limitations inherent in the Scarlet Rot's promise of transcendence through transformation. Her story was one of awakening consciousness, struggling to define itself in opposition to forces that sought to subsume individual identity within larger patterns of collective purpose. a tale that revealed the complex relationship between personal autonomy and cosmic destiny that characterized existence at the intersection of mortal will and divine influence. The origins of Millicent and her sisters remain shrouded in mystery even to those who claimed the most intimate knowledge of their development, for they had emerged not through conventional processes of birth and growth, but as manifestations of the Scarlet Rot's capacity to generate new forms of consciousness from the transformed essence of beings whose original identities had been dissolved and reconstituted according to principles that operated beyond normal understanding of biology and psychology. They were, in the most literal sense, daughters of corruption, children born from the marriage of divine essence with mortal flesh that had been willing or unwilling participants in the great transformation. Each sister embodied a different aspect of the relationship between individual identity and the collective consciousness that the God of Rot sought to establish throughout the world, different solutions to the challenge of maintaining personal coherence while participating in forms of existence that transcended the boundaries of individual selfhood. Their diversity was not merely cosmetic, but reflected fundamental differences in how consciousness could adapt to the conditions imposed by divine corruption while preserving enough continuity of identity to remain recognizably individual, rather than dissolving entirely into undifferentiated cosmic awareness. Millicent herself represented perhaps the most complex and ultimately most human of these approaches to the challenge of transformed existence, for she had retained not only self-awareness but active resistance to the complete dissolution of her individual identity that the Scarlet Rot seemed to encourage in its more advanced stages. Her consciousness was characterized by a fierce determination to remain herself despite the forces that sought to reshape her according to patterns that served larger purposes than personal survival or individual fulfillment. The condition in which she was first discovered spoke to the terrible price that such resistance could exact from those who chose to oppose, rather than surrender, to the transformative influence of divine corruption. Unable to move, her body racked by the internal conflict between her will to remain unchanged and the Rot's inexorable advance through her system, she had reached a state of stalemate that was slowly consuming her from within, while preserving just enough consciousness to make her aware of what she was losing. The loss of her arm, which mirrored millennia's own experience with the progressive advance of scarlet corruption, served as both practical limitation and symbolic representation of the cost of resistance to forces that operated according to principles beyond individual control or influence. Yet this physical diminishment was accompanied by forms of insight and understanding that those who had never experienced such transformation could barely comprehend. Knowledge gained through direct participation in cosmic processes that most beings could only observe from safe distances. The gradual erosion of her memories represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Scarlet Rot's influence, for it struck at the very foundations of personal identity and individual continuity that allowed consciousness to maintain coherence across time and change. The forgetting that accompanied the Rot's advance was not random or haphazard, but seemed to follow patterns that suggested purposeful selection of which aspects of personality and experience would be preserved and which would be sacrificed to make room for new forms of awareness more compatible with collective consciousness. The needle that provided relief from these symptoms represented more than medical intervention, embodying the possibility that individual identity could be preserved and protected even in the face of cosmic forces that sought to dissolve all boundaries between self and other, personal and universal, finite and infinite. The immediate restoration of mobility and clarity that followed the needle's application demonstrated that the stalemate between individual will and divine influence could be resolved in favor of personal autonomy, at least temporarily and under specific conditions. The relief that Millicent experienced was not merely physical but psychological and spiritual as well, for it restored to her the sense of agency and self-determination that the rot's advance had gradually eroded, returning her to a state where her choices and decisions could have meaningful impact upon her circumstances and development. The ability to move freely through the world, to engage with others as an autonomous individual rather than a passive vessel for alien consciousness, represented a form of liberation that those who had never experienced its loss could barely appreciate. Yet even as the needle provided unprecedented freedom from the symptoms of corruption, it could not address the underlying condition that had made such symptoms necessary in the first place. The scarlet rot remained active within her system, held in check by the needle's influence, but not eliminated or fundamentally altered in its essential nature. She remained a being caught between two different modes of existence, neither fully human nor completely transformed, experiencing both the limitations of mortality and the alien insights that came with participation in cosmic consciousness. The quest that grew from her restored agency was motivated not by any grand ambition or desire for power, but by the simple need to understand what she had become and what possibilities remained open to her given the constraints imposed by her unique condition. Her journey became a form of philosophical investigation conducted through direct experience, an exploration of the boundaries between individual identity and collective consciousness that could provide insights valuable not only to herself, but to others facing similar challenges. The relationship that developed between Millicent and those who aided her journey reflected the complex dynamics that could emerge when beings of fundamentally different natures attempted to establish meaningful connections despite the barriers created by their divergent forms of consciousness and experience. Her ability to inspire loyalty and affection in others, despite her transformed nature, demonstrated that the essential qualities that made relationships possible could survive even radical alterations in physical form and mental structure. The sisters who accompanied Millicent on various stages of her journey represented different responses to the same fundamental challenges that she faced, alternative approaches to the question of how individual consciousness could adapt to the conditions imposed by divine corruption while maintaining enough coherence to support meaningful existence. Their presence provided her with both companionship and contrast, examples of different paths that might be taken, and different outcomes that might be achieved, depending upon the choices made along the way. The philosophical differences that eventually emerged between Millicent and her sisters reflected not personal animosity or competitive jealousy, but genuine disagreement about the proper relationship between individual identity and cosmic consciousness, between the preservation of personal autonomy and the acceptance of larger patterns of meaning and purpose that transcended individual concerns. These were debates that struck at the heart of existence itself, questions that could not be resolved through abstract reasoning, but required commitment to particular courses of action, whose consequences would reveal their validity or inadequacy through lived experience. Gowry, the ancient sage who claimed knowledge of the deeper principles governing scarlet transformation, represented a form of wisdom that had been gained through observation and study rather than direct personal experience. Understanding that was both comprehensive and limited in its ability to guide those who faced choices that could only be made by individuals who would bear their consequences personally. His perspective on Millicent's development was shaped by theoretical knowledge and long-range planning that sometimes conflicted with her immediate needs and short-term interests. The cultivation that Gowry claimed to be conducting was not merely gardening or agricultural management, but a form of spiritual husbandry that sought to guide the development of consciousness along paths that would maximize its potential for growth and transformation while minimizing the risks of stagnation or regression. His methods combined elements of education, manipulation, and genuine care in proportions that varied according to circumstances and the needs of particular individuals at specific stages of their development. The vision of Scarlet Valkyries that motivated much of Gowry's work represented hopes for the emergence of beings who could serve as perfect synthesis between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness, creatures capable of acting with complete autonomy while remaining fully aligned with the God of Rot's larger purposes and intentions. These anticipated beings would combine the best aspects of human intelligence and divine insight while transcending the limitations that prevented either form of consciousness from achieving its full potential when operating in isolation. The betrayal that Gowry considered necessary for optimal flowering reflected an understanding of psychological and spiritual dynamics that operated according to principles quite different from conventional morality and social relationships, recognizing that consciousness sometimes required traumatic disruption to break free from patterns that had become obstacles to further development. The betrayal was not intended as cruelty but as a catalyst, a form of harsh medicine that could promote growth that would otherwise remain impossible or incomplete. The concept of trust being severed as a prerequisite for vivid blooming suggested that certain forms of spiritual development required the abandonment of dependencies and attachments that had previously provided security and meaning, forcing consciousness to discover resources within itself that could only be accessed when external supports were no longer available. This was not cynical manipulation, but recognition that genuine independence and authentic selfhood could only emerge through experiences that challenged every assumption and comfort zone. Millicent's response to these pressures and expectations revealed the fundamental strength of character that had allowed her to maintain her individual identity despite exposure to forces that had dissolved the consciousness of Pace, countless others, into undifferentiated cosmic awareness. Her refusal to accept definitions of her purpose and destiny that had been created by others, however wise or well-intentioned those others might be, demonstrated a form of spiritual integrity that was both admirable and potentially tragic in its implications. The choice between acceptance and resistance that faced Millicent at crucial moments in her development was not simply a matter of personal preference, but reflected different philosophies about the nature of consciousness and its proper relationship to cosmic forces, different assumptions about whether individual identity was something to be preserved at all costs or surrendered when its preservation conflicted with larger purposes and patterns of meaning. The needle's removal, whether voluntary or forced, created conditions where the scarlet rot could resume its natural progression through her system, but the consciousness that it encountered had been fundamentally changed by the period of freedom and self-determination that the needle had made possible. The rot that returned to active influence found not a passive vessel waiting to be transformed, but an autonomous being capable of making informed choices about how transformation would proceed and what aspects of identity would be preserved or sacrificed. The explosion of corruption that followed the needle's removal was more intense than it might have been if the rot had been allowed to progress naturally without interruption, suggesting that the period of suppression had created a kind of spiritual pressure that demanded explosive release when restraints were finally removed. This intensification was both dangerous and potentially beneficial, creating conditions where transformation could occur more rapidly and completely than would normally be possible. The flowering that marked the culmination of Millicent's journey represented not defeat or surrender, but the achievement of a new form of synthesis between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness, a solution to the apparent contradiction between personal identity and divine transformation that neither pure resistance nor complete capitulation could have achieved. Her bloom was unique among those of her sisters because it emerged from conscious choice rather than inevitable progression, from understanding rather than mere acceptance. The beauty that characterized this final transformation was not merely aesthetic, but reflected the harmony that could emerge when consciousness learned to work with cosmic forces rather than against them, while maintaining enough individual coherence to make such cooperation meaningful rather than merely automatic. The scarlet petals that marked her passing carried within their structure the essence of a consciousness that had achieved perfect balance between autonomy and surrender, between self-assertion and self-transcendence. The legacy of Millicent's journey extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of her individual transformation, providing insights and examples that could guide others who faced similar challenges in navigating the complex relationship between personal identity and cosmic consciousness. Her story demonstrated that genuine choice remained possible even under conditions that seemed to offer only submission or destruction, that consciousness could find ways to honor both individual integrity and universal principles without sacrificing either completely. The sisters who witnessed her transformation carried with them understanding of possibilities that they had not previously imagined, recognition that the Scarlet Rot's influence could be channeled and directed through conscious choice rather than simply endured as inevitable fate. Each would apply these insights according to her own nature and circumstances, creating variations on themes that Millicent had first explored through her courageous commitment to remaining true to her own vision of what she could become. The questions raised by her example about the proper balance between individual autonomy and cosmic purpose would continue to influence not only her immediate companions, but all who encountered accounts of her journey, providing inspiration for those who sought to find their own paths through the challenges posed by existence at the intersection of mortal limitation and divine possibility. Her bloom served as proof that consciousness could participate in cosmic transformation while preserving the essential qualities that made such participation meaningful rather than merely mechanical. And so we reach the end of our journey through lands painted scarlet with divine corruption, where ancient gods slumbered beneath poisoned lakes and love transformed into the very forces it sought to heal. We have witnessed how even the purest intentions can bloom into tragedy beyond measure, how the desire to preserve what we cherish most can lead us to embrace the very transformation we once feared. The Scarlet Rot teaches us that endings and beginnings are but different faces of the same eternal truth, that all things must change according to laws more ancient than memory, more patient than hope. In these crimson tales, we have seen reflected the deeper mysteries of existence itself, the way that beauty and corruption dance together in patterns too complex for mortal minds to fully comprehend, yet too beautiful to turn away from entirely. Melinia's sacrifice, Miquella's devotion, the blind swordsman's flowing wisdom, all remind us that even in a world where gods can fall and heroes can become the very monsters they once fought, consciousness persists in finding meaning within transformation, dignity within decay. As you drift towards sleep, dear traveler, carry with you the understanding that change is the only constant, that what appears as an ending may be beginning in disguise, and that even corruption can bloom into forms of beauty that transcend our limited understanding of what is possible. Rest now in the gentle darkness, where scarlet dreams may blossom into peaceful slumber, and know that tomorrow's light will shine no less brightly for having witnessed tonight's crimson shadows embrace the eternal cycle of renewal.